Chapter 19 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. Ruth and her family were home again, and Martin, returned to Oakland, saw much of her. Having gained her degree, she was doing no more studying, and he, having worked all vitality out of his mind and body, was doing no writing. This gave them time for each other that they had never had before, and their intimacy ripened fast. At first, Martin had done nothing but rest. He had slept a great deal, and spent long hours musing and thinking and doing nothing. He was like one recovering from some terrible bout of hardship. The first signs of reawakening came when he discovered more than languid interest in the daily paper. Then he began to read again, light novels and poetry, and after several days more, he was head over heels in his long-neglected Fisk. His splendid body and health made new vitality, and he possessed all the resiliency and rebound of youth. Ruth showed her disappointment plainly when he announced that he was going to sea for another voyage as soon as he was well rested. "Why do you want to do that?" she asked. "Money," was the answer. "I'll have to lay in a supply for my next attack on the editors. Money is the sinews of war, in my case, money and patience." "But if all you wanted was money, why didn't you stay in the laundry?" "Because the laundry was making a beast of me. Too much work of that sort drives to drink." She stared at him with horror in her eyes. "Do you mean—" she quavered. It would have been easy for him to get out of it, but his natural impulse was for frankness, and he remembered his old resolve to be frank, no matter what happened. "Yes," he answered. "Just that, several times." She shivered and drew away from him. "No man I have ever known did that, ever did that." "Then they never worked in the laundry at Shelley Springs." He laughed bitterly. "Toil is a good thing. It is necessary for human health, so all the preachers say, and heaven knows I've never been afraid of it. But there is such a thing as too much of a good thing, and the laundry up there is one of them. That's why I'm going to sea one more voyage. It will be my last, I think. For when I come back, I shall break into the magazines. I am certain of it." She was silent, unsympathetic, and he watched her moodily, realizing how impossible it was for her to understand what he had been through. "Some day I shall write it up, the degradation of toil, or the psychology of drink in the working class, or something like that for a title." Never, since the first meeting, had they seemed so far apart as that day. His confession, told in frankness, with the spirit of revolt behind, had repelled her. But she was more shocked by the repulsion itself than by the cause of it. It pointed out to her how near she had drawn to him, and, once accepted, it paved the way for greater intimacy. Pity, too, was aroused, and innocent, idealistic thoughts of reform. She would save this raw young man who had come so far. She would save him from the curse of his early environment, and she would save him from himself, in spite of himself. And all this affected her as a very noble state of consciousness, nor did she dream that behind it and underlying it were the jealousy and desire of love. They rode on their wheels much in the delightful fall weather, and out in the hills they read poetry aloud, now one and now the other, noble, uplifting poetry that turned one's thoughts to higher things. Renunciation, sacrifice, patience, industry, and high endeavor were the principles she thus indirectly preached, such abstractions being objectified in her mind by her father and Mr. Butler, and by Andrew Carnegie, who, from a poor immigrant boy, had arisen to be the book-giver of the world. All of this was appreciated and enjoyed by Martin. He followed her mental processes more clearly now, and her soul was no longer the sealed wonder it had been. He was on terms of intellectual equality with her. But the points of disagreement did not affect his love. His love was more ardent than ever, for he loved her for what she was, and even her physical frailty was an added charm in his eyes. He read of sickly Elizabeth Barrett, who for years had not placed her feet upon the ground, until that day of flame when she eloped with Browning and stood upright, upon the earth, under the open sky. And what Browning had done for her, Martin decided he could do for Ruth. But first she must love him. The rest would be easy. He would give her strength and health, and he caught glimpses of their life, in the years to come, wherein, against a background of work and comfort and general well-being, he saw himself and Ruth reading and discussing poetry, she propped amid a multitude of cushions on the ground, while she read aloud to him. This was the key to the life they would live. And always he saw that particular picture. Sometimes it was she who leaned against him while he read, one arm about her, her head upon his shoulder. Sometimes they pored together over the printed pages of beauty. Then, too, she loved nature, and with generous imagination he changed the scene of their reading. Sometimes they read in closed-in valleys with precipitous walls, or in high mountain meadows, and again, down by the gray sand dunes with a wreath of billows at their feet, or afar on some volcanic tropic isle, where waterfalls descended and became mist, reaching the sea in vapor veils that swayed and shivered to every vagrant wisp of wind. But always, in the foreground, lords of beauty and eternally reading and sharing, lay he and Ruth. And always in the background that was beyond the background of nature, dim and hazy, were work and success and money earned that made them free of the world and all its treasures. "I should recommend my little girl to be careful," her mother warned her one day. "I know what you mean, but it is impossible. He is not—" Ruth was blushing, but it was the blush of maidenhood, called upon for the first time to discuss the sacred things of life, with a mother held equally sacred. "You're kind," her mother finished the sentence for her. Ruth nodded. "I did not want to say it, but he is not. He is rough, brutal, strong, too strong. He has not—" She hesitated and could not go on. It was a new experience, talking over such matters with her mother. And again her mother completed her thought for her. "He has not lived a clean life, is what you wanted to say." Again Ruth nodded, and again a blush mantled her face. "It is just that," she said. "It has not been his fault, but he has played much with pitch. Yes, with pitch, and he frightens me. Sometimes I am positively in terror of him, when he talks in that free and easy way of the things he has done, as if they did not matter. They do matter, don't they?" They sat with their arms twined around each other, and in the pause her mother patted her hand and waited for her to go on. "But I am interested in him dreadfully," she continued. "In a way he is my protégé. Then, too, he is my first boy-friend. Not exactly friend, rather protégé and friend combined. Sometimes, too, when he frightens me, it seems that he is a bulldog I have taken for a plaything, like some of the frat girls, and he is tugging hard and showing his teeth and threatening to break loose." Again her mother waited. "He interests me, I suppose, like the bulldog. And there is much good in him, too, but there is much in him that I would not like in the other way. You see, I have been thinking. He swears, he smokes, he drinks. He has fought with his fists. He has told me so, and he likes it, he says so. He is all that a man should not be, a man I would want for my—" her voice sank very low, "husband. Then he is too strong. My prince must be tall and slender and dark, a graceful, bewitching prince. No, there is no danger of my falling in love with Martin Eden. It would be the worst fate that could befall me." "But it is not that I spoke about," her mother equivocated. "Have you thought about him? He is so ineligible in every way, you know. And suppose he should come to love you." "But he does already," she cried. "It was to be expected," Mrs. Morse said gently. "How could it be otherwise with anyone who knew you?" "Only hates me!" she exclaimed passionately. "And I hate Olney. I always feel like a cat when he is around. I feel that I must be nasty to him. And even when I don't happen to feel that way, why, he's nasty to me anyway. But I am happy with Martin Eden. No one ever loved me before, no man, I mean, in that way. And it is sweet to be loved, that way. You know what I mean, mother dear. It is sweet to feel that you are really and truly a woman." She buried her face in her mother's lap, sobbing. "You think I am dreadful, I know, but I am honest, and I tell you just how I feel." Mrs. Morse was strangely sad and happy. Her child daughter, who was a bachelor of arts, was gone. But in her place was a woman daughter. The experiment had succeeded. The strange void in Ruth's nature had been filled, and filled without danger or penalty. This rough sailor fellow had been the instrument, and, though Ruth did not love him, he had made her conscious of her womanhood. "His hand trembles," Ruth was confessing, her face, for shame's sake, still buried. "It is almost amusing and ridiculous, but I feel sorry for him, too. And when his hands are too trembly, and his eyes too shiny, why, I lecture him about his life and the wrong way he is going about it to mend it. But he worships me, I know. His eyes and his hands do not lie. And it makes me feel grown up, the thought of it, the very thought of it. And I feel that I am possessed of something that is by rights my own, that makes me like the other girls, and young women. And then, too, I knew that I was not like them before, and I knew that it worried you. You thought you did not let me know that dear worry of yours, but I did, and I wanted to make good, as Martin Eden says." It was a holy hour for mother and daughter, and their eyes were wet as they talked on in the twilight. Ruth all white innocence and frankness, her mother sympathetic, receptive, yet calmly explaining and guiding. "He is 4 years younger than you," she said. "He has no place in the world. He has neither position nor salary. He is impractical. Loving you, he should, in the name of common sense, be doing something that would give him the right to marry, instead of paltering around with those stories of his and with childish dreams. Martin Eden, I am afraid, will never grow up. He does not take to responsibility and a man's work in the world like your father did, or like all our friends, Mr. Butler for one. Martin Eden, I am afraid, will never be a money-earner. And this world is so ordered that money is necessary to happiness. Oh no, not these swollen fortunes, but enough money to permit of common comfort and decency. He has never spoken. He has not breathed a word. He has not attempted to. But if he did, I would not let him, because, you see, I do not love him. I am glad of that. I should not care to see my daughter, my one daughter, who is so clean and pure, love a man like him. There are noble men in the world, who are clean and true and manly. Wait for them. You will find one some day, and you will love him and be loved by him, and you will be happy with him as your father and I have been happy with each other. And there is one thing you must always carry in mind." "Yes, mother?" Mrs. Morse's voice was low and sweet as she said, "And that is the children." "I have thought about them," Ruth confessed, remembering the wanton thoughts that had vexed her in the past, her face again red with maiden shame that she should be telling such things. "And it is that, the children, that makes Mr. Eden impossible," Mrs. Morse went on incisively. "Their heritage must be clean, and he is, I am afraid, not clean. Your father has told me of sailors' lives, and you understand." Ruth pressed her mother's hand in assent, feeling that she really did understand, though her conception was of something vague, remote, and terrible that was beyond the scope of imagination. "You know I do nothing without telling you," she began. "Only sometimes you must ask me, like this time. I wanted to tell you, but I did not know how. It is false modesty, I know it is that, But you can make it easy for me. Sometimes, like this time, you must ask me. You must give me a chance." "Why, Mother, you are a woman, too!" she cried exultantly as they stood up, catching her mother's hands and standing erect, facing her in the twilight, conscious of a strangely sweet equality between them. "I should never have thought of you in that way if we had not had this talk. I had to learn that I was a woman to know that you were one, too." "We are women together," her mother said, drawing her to her and kissing her. "We are women together," she repeated, as they went out of the room, their arms around each other's waists, their hearts swelling with a new sense of companionship. "Our little girl has become a woman," Mrs. Morse said proudly to her husband an hour later. "That means," he said, after a long look at his wife, "that means she is in love." "No, but that she is loved," was the smiling rejoinder. "The experiment has succeeded. She is awakened at last." "Then we'll have to get rid of him." Mr. Morse spoke briskly, in matter-of-fact, business-like tones. But his wife shook her head. "It will not be necessary. Ruth says he is going to sea in a few days. When he comes back, she will not be here. We will send her to Aunt Clara's. And besides, a year in the East, with the change in climate, people, ideas, and everything, is just the thing she needs." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. The desire to write was stirring in Martin once more. Stories and poems were springing into spontaneous creation in his brain, and he made notes of them against the future time when he would give them expression. But he did not write. This was his little vacation. He had resolved to devote it to rest and love, and in both matters he prospered. He was soon spilling over with vitality, and each day he saw Ruth, at the moment of meeting, she experienced the old shock of his strength and health. "Be careful," her mother warned her once again. "I am afraid that you are seeing too much of Martin Eden." But Ruth laughed from security. She was sure of herself, and in a few days he would be off to sea. Then, by the time he returned, she would be away on her visit east. There was a magic, however, in the strength and health of Martin. He, too, had been told of her contemplated eastern trip, and he felt the need for haste. Yet he did not know how to make love to a girl like Ruth. Then, too, he was handicapped by the possession of a great fund of experience with girls and women who had been absolutely different from her. They had known about love and life and flirtation, while she knew nothing about such things. Her prodigious innocence appalled him, freezing on his lips all ardors of speech, and convincing him, in spite of himself, of his own unworthiness. Also, he was handicapped in another way. He had himself never been in love before. He had liked women, in that turgid past of his, and been fascinated by some of them. But he had not known what it was to love them. He had whistled in a masterful, careless way, and they had come to him. They had been diversions, incidents, part of the game men play, but a small part at most. And now, and for the first time, he was a suppliant, tender and timid and doubting. He did not know the way of love, nor its speech, while he was frightened at his loved one's clear innocence. In the course of getting acquainted with a varied world, whirling on through the ever-changing phases of it, he had learned a rule of conduct which was to the effect that when one played a strange game, he should let the other fellow play first. This had stood him in good stead 1,000 times, and trained him as an observer as well. He knew how to watch the thing that was strange, and to wait for a weakness, for a place of entrance, to divulge itself. It was like sparring for an opening in fist-fighting. And when such an opening came, he knew by long experience to play for it and to play hard. So he waited with Ruth and watched, desiring to speak his love, but not daring. He was afraid of shocking her, and he was not sure of himself. Had he but known it, he was following the right course with her. Love came into the world before articulate speech, and in its own early youth it had learned the ways and means that it had never forgotten. It was in this old, primitive way that Martin wooed Ruth. He did not know he was doing it at first, though later he divined it. The touch of his hand on hers was vastly more potent than any word he could utter. The impact of his strength on her imagination was more alluring than the printed poems and spoken passions of 1,000 generations of lovers. Whatever his tongue could express would have appealed, in part, to her judgment. But the touch of hand, the fleeting contact, made its way directly to her instinct. Her judgment was as young as she, but her instincts were as old as the race and older. They had been young when love was young, and they were wiser than convention and opinion and all the newborn things. So her judgment did not act. There was no call upon it, and she did not realize the strength of the appeal Martin made from moment to her love nature. That he loved her, on the other hand, was as clear as day, and she consciously delighted in beholding his love manifestations. The glowing eyes, with their tender lights, the trembling hands, and the never-failing swarthy flush that flooded darkly under his sunburn. She even went farther, in a timid way inciting him, but doing it so delicately that he never suspected, and doing it half-consciously, so that she scarcely suspected herself. She thrilled with these proofs of her power that proclaimed her a woman. And she took an Eve-like delight in tormenting him and playing upon him. Tongue-tied by inexperience and by excess of ardor, wooing unwittingly and awkwardly, Martin continued his approach by contact. The touch of his hand was pleasant to her, and something deliciously more than pleasant. Martin did not know it, but he did know that it was not distasteful to her. Not that they touched hands often, save at meeting and parting, and that in handling the bicycles, in strapping on the books of verse they carried into the hills, and in conning the pages of books side by side. There were opportunities for hand to stray against hand. And there were opportunities, too, for her hair to brush his cheek, and for shoulder to touch shoulder, as they leaned together over the beauty of the books. She smiled to herself at vagrant impulses which arose from nowhere, and suggested that she rumple his hair, while he desired greatly, when they tired of reading, to rest his head in her lap, and dream with closed eyes about the future that was to be theirs. On Sunday picnics at Shellmound Park and Schuetzen Park in the past, he had rested his head on many laps, and, usually, he had slept soundly and selfishly while the girls shaded his face from the sun, and looked down and loved him, and wondered at his lordly carelessness of their love. To rest his head in a girl's lap had been the easiest thing in the world until now, and now he found Ruth's lap inaccessible and impossible. Yet it was right here, in his reticence, that the strength of his wooing lay. It was because of this reticence that he never alarmed her. Herself fastidious and timid, she never awakened to the perilous trend of their intercourse. Subtly and unaware, she grew toward him and closer to him, while he, sensing the growing closeness, longed to dare, but was afraid. Once he dared, one afternoon, when he found her in the darkened living room with a blinding headache. "Nothing can do it any good," she answered his inquiries. "And besides, I don't take headache powders. Dr. Hall won't permit me." "I can cure it, I think, and without drugs," was Martin's answer. "I am not sure, of course, but I'd like to try. It's simply massage. I learned the trick first from the Japanese. They are a race of masseurs, you know. Then I learned it all over again with variations from the Hawaiians. They call it lomi lomi. It can accomplish most of the things drugs accomplish, and a few things that drugs can't." Scarcely had his hands touched her head when she sighed deeply. "That is so good," she said. She spoke once again, half an hour later, when she asked, "Aren't you tired?" The question was perfunctory, and she knew what the answer would be. Then she lost herself in drowsy contemplation of the soothing balm of his strength. Life poured from the ends of his fingers, driving the pain before it, or so it seemed to her, until with the easement of pain she fell asleep and he stole away. She called him up by telephone that evening to thank him. "I slept until dinner," she said. "You cured me completely, Mr. Eden, and I don't know how to thank you." He was warm and bungling of speech and very happy as he replied to her, and there was dancing in his mind throughout the telephone conversation the memory of Browning and sickly Elizabeth Barrett. What had been done could be done again, and he, Martin Eden, could do it and would do it for Ruth Morse. He went back to his room, to the volume of Spencer's Sociology lying open on the bed. But he could not read. Love tormented him and overrode his will, so that, despite all determination, he found himself at the little ink-stained table. The sonnet he composed that night was the first of a love cycle of 50 sonnets, which was completed within 2 months. He had the love sonnets of the Portuguese in mind as he wrote, and he wrote under the best conditions for great work, at a climacteric of living, in the throes of his own sweet love madness. The many hours he was not with Ruth he devoted to the love cycle, to reading at home, or to the public reading rooms, where he got more closely in touch with the magazines of the day, and the nature of their policy and content. The hours he spent with Ruth were maddening alike in promise and in inconclusiveness. It was a week after he cured her headache that a moonlight sail on Lake Merritt was proposed, by Norman and seconded by Arthur and Olney. Martin was the only one capable of handling a boat, and he was pressed into service. Ruth sat near him in the stern, while the 3 young fellows lounged amidships, deep in a wordy wrangle over frat affairs. The moon had not yet risen, and Ruth, gazing into the starry vault of the sky, and exchanging no speech with Martin, experienced a sudden feeling of loneliness. She glanced at him. A puff of wind was heeling the boat over till the deck was awash, and he, one hand on tiller and the other on main sheet, was luffing slightly, at the same time peering ahead to make out the near-lying north shore. He was unaware of her gaze, and she watched him intently, speculating fancifully about the strange warp of soul that led him, a young man with signal powers, to fritter away his time on the writing of stories and poems, foredoomed to mediocrity and failure. Her eyes wandered along the strong throat, dimly seen in the starlight, and over the firm poised head, and the old desire to lay her hands upon his neck came back to her. The strength she abhorred attracted her. Her feeling of loneliness became more pronounced, and she felt tired. Her position on the heeling boat irked her, and she remembered the headache he had cured and the soothing rest that resided in him. He was sitting beside her, quite beside her, and the boat seemed to tilt her toward him. Then arose in her the impulse to lean against him, to rest herself against his strength, a vague, half-formed impulse which, even as she considered it, mastered her and made her lean toward him. Or was it the heeling of the boat? She did not know. She never knew. She knew only that she was leaning against him and that the easement and soothing rest were very good. Perhaps it had been the boat's fault, but she made no effort to retrieve it. She leaned lightly against his shoulder, but she leaned, and she continued to lean when he shifted his position to make it more comfortable for her. It was a madness, but she refused to consider the madness. She was no longer herself but a woman, with a woman's clinging need, and though she leaned ever so lightly, the need seemed satisfied. She was no longer tired. Martin did not speak. Had he, the spell would have been broken. But his reticence of love prolonged it. He was dazed and dizzy. He could not understand what was happening. It was too wonderful to be anything but a delirium. He conquered a mad desire to let go sheet and tiller and to clasp her in his arms. His intuition told him it was the wrong thing to do, and he was glad that sheet and tiller kept his hands occupied and fended off temptation. But he luffed the boat less delicately, spilling the wind shamelessly from the sail, so as to prolong the tack to the north shore. The shore would compel him to go about, and the contact would be broken. He sailed with skill, stopping way on the boat without exciting the notice of the wranglers, and mentally forgiving his hardest voyages in that they had made this marvelous night possible, giving him mastery over sea and boat and wind, so that he could sail with her beside him, her dear weight against him on his shoulder. When the first light of the rising moon touched the sail, illuminating the boat with pearly radiance, Ruth moved away from him. And, even as she moved, she felt him move away. The impulse to avoid detection was mutual. The episode was tacitly and secretly intimate. She sat apart from him with burning cheeks, while the full force of it came home to her. She had been guilty of something she would not have her brothers see, nor only see. Why had she done it? She had never done anything like it in her life, and yet she had been moonlight sailing with young men before. She had never desired to do anything like it. She was overcome with shame, and with the mystery of her own burgeoning womanhood. She stole a glance at Martin, who was busy putting the boat about on the other tack, and she could have hated him for having made her do an immodest and shameful thing. And he, of all men! Perhaps her mother was right, and she was seeing too much of him. It would never happen again, she resolved, and she would see less of him in the future. She entertained a wild idea of explaining to him the first time they were alone together, of lying to him, of mentioning casually the attack of faintness that had overpowered her just before the moon came up. Then she remembered how they had drawn mutually away before the revealing moon, and she knew he would know it for a lie. In the days that swiftly followed, she was no longer herself, but a strange, puzzling creature, willful over judgment and scornful of self-analysis, refusing to peer into the future or to think about herself and whither she was drifting. She was in a fever of tingling mystery, alternately frightened and charmed, and in constant bewilderment. She had one idea firmly fixed, however, which ensured her security. She would not let Martin speak his love. As long as she did this, all would be well. In a few days he would be off to sea, and even if he did speak, all would be well. It could not be otherwise, for she did not love him. Of course, it would be a painful half-hour for him, and an embarrassing half-hour for her, because it would be her first proposal. She thrilled deliciously at the thought. She was really a woman, with a man ripe to ask for her in marriage. It was a lure to all that was fundamental in her sex. The fabric of her life, of all that constituted her, quivered and grew tremulous. The thought fluttered in her mind like a flame-attracted moth. She went so far as to imagine Martin proposing, herself putting the words into his mouth, and she rehearsed her refusal, tempering it with kindness, and exhorting him to true and noble manhood. And especially, he must stop smoking cigarettes. She would make a point of that. But no, she must not let him speak at all. She could stop him, and she had told her mother that she would. All flushed and burning, she regretfully dismissed the conjured situation. Her first proposal would have to be deferred to a more propitious time and a more eligible suitor. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. Came a beautiful fall day, warm and languid, palpitant with the hush of the changing season, a California Indian summer day. with hazy sun and wandering wisps of breeze that did not stir the slumber of the air, filmy purple mists that were not vapors but fabrics woven of color, hid the recesses of the hills. San Francisco lay like a blur of smoke under her heights. The intervening bay was a dull sheen of molten metal, whereon sailing craft lay motionless or drifted with the lazy tide. Far Tamalpais, barely seen in the silver haze, bulked hugely by the Golden Gate, the latter a pale gold pathway under the westering sun. Beyond, the Pacific, dim and vast, was raising on its skyline tumbled cloud masses that swept landward, giving warning of the first blustering breath of winter. The erasure of summer was at hand, yet summer lingered, fading and fainting among her hills, deepening the purple of her valleys, spinning a shroud of haze from waning powers and sated raptures, dying with the calm content of having lived and lived well. And among the hills, on their favorite knoll, Martin and Ruth sat side by side, their heads bent over the same pages, he reading aloud from the love sonnets of the woman who had loved Browning, as it is given to few men to be loved. But the reading languished. The spell of passing beauty all about them was too strong. The golden year was dying as it had lived, a beautiful and unrepentant voluptuary. The reminiscent rapture and content freighted heavily the air. It entered into them, dreamy and languorous, weakening the fibers of resolution, suffusing the face of morality or of judgment with haze and purple mist. Martin felt tender and melting, and from time to time warm glows passed over him. His head was very near to hers, and when wandering phantoms of breeze stirred her hair so that it touched his face, the printed pages swam before his eyes. "I don't believe you know a word of what you are reading," she said once, when he had lost his place. He looked at her with burning eyes, and was on the verge of becoming awkward when a retort came to his lips. "I don't believe you know either. What was that last sonnet about?" "I don't know," she laughed frankly. "I've already forgotten. Don't let us read any more. The day is too beautiful." "It will be our last in the hills for some time," he announced gravely. "There's a storm gathering out there on the sea rim." The book slipped from his hands to the ground, and they sat idly and silently, gazing out over the dreamy bay with eyes that dreamed and did not see. Ruth glanced sidewise at his neck. She did not lean toward him. She was drawn by some force outside of herself, and stronger than gravitation, strong as destiny. It was only an inch to lean, and it was accomplished without volition on her part. Her shoulder touched his as lightly as a butterfly touches a flower, and just as lightly was the counter-pressure. She felt his shoulder press hers, and a tremor run through him. Then was the time for her to draw back, but she had become an automaton. Her actions had passed beyond the control of her will. She never thought of control or will in the delicious madness that was upon her. His arm began to steal behind her and around her. She waited its slow progress in a torment of delight. She waited, she knew not for what, panting, with dry, burning lips, a leaping pulse, and a fever of expectancy in all her blood. The girdling arm lifted higher and drew her toward him, drew her slowly and caressingly. She could wait no longer. With a tired sigh, and with an impulsive movement all her own, unpremeditated, spasmodic, she rested her head upon his breast. His head bent over swiftly, and, as his lips approached, hers flew to meet them. This must be love, she thought, in the one rational moment that was vouchsafed her. If it was not love, it was too shameful. It could be nothing else than love. She loved the man whose arms were around her and whose lips were pressed to hers. She pressed more, tightly to him, with a snuggling movement of her body. And a moment later, tearing herself half out of his embrace, suddenly and exultantly she reached up and placed both hands upon Martin Eden's sunburnt neck. So exquisite was the pang of love and desire fulfilled that she uttered a low moan, relaxed her hands, and lay half swooning in his arms. Not a word had been spoken, and not a word was spoken for a long time. Twice he bent and kissed her, and each time her lips met his shyly, and her body made its happy, nestling movement. She clung to him, unable to release herself, and he sat, half supporting her in his arms, as he gazed with unseeing eyes at the blur of the great city across the bay. For once there were no visions in his brain. Only colors and lights and glows pulsed there, warm as the day and warm as his love. He bent over her. She was speaking. "When did you love me?" she whispered. "From the first, the very first, the first moment I laid eye on you. I was mad for love of you then, and in all the time that has passed since then. I have only grown the madder. I am maddest now, dear. I am almost a lunatic. My head is so turned with joy." "I am glad I am a woman, Martin, dear," she said, after a long sigh. He crushed her in his arms again, and then he asked, "And you, when did you first know?" "Oh, I knew all the time, almost, from the first." "And I have been as blind as a bat," he cried, a ring of vexation in his voice. "I never dreamed it until just now, when I kissed you." "I didn't mean that." She drew herself partly away and looked at him. "I meant I knew you loved almost from the first." "And you?" he demanded. "It came to me suddenly." She was speaking very slowly, her eyes warm and fluttery and melting, a soft flush on her cheeks that did not go away. "I never knew until just now, when you put your arms around me. And I never expected to marry you, Martin, not until just now." "How did you make me love you?" "I don't know," he laughed, "unless just by loving you, for I loved you hard enough to melt the heart of a stone, much less the heart of the living, breathing woman you are." "This is so different from what I thought love would be," she announced irrelevantly. "What did you think it would be like?" "I didn't think it would be like this." She was looking into his eyes at the moment, but her own dropped as she continued. "You see, I didn't know what this was like." He offered to draw her toward him again, but it was no more than a tentative muscular movement of the girdling arm, for he feared that he might be greedy. Then he felt her body yielding, and once again she was close in his arms, and lips were pressed on lips. "What will my people say?" she queried, with sudden apprehension, in one of the pauses. "I don't know. We can find out very easily any time we are so minded." "But if Mamma objects, I am sure I am afraid to tell her." "Let me tell her," he volunteered valiantly. "I think your mother does not like me, but I can win her around. A fellow who can win you can win anything, and if we don't—" "Yes?" "Why, we'll have each other. And there's no danger not winning your mother to our marriage. She loves you too well." "I should not like to break her heart," Ruth said pensively. He felt like assuring her that mothers' hearts were not so easily broken, but instead he said, "And love is the greatest thing in the world." "Do you know, Martin, you sometimes frighten me. I am frightened now, when I think of you and of what you have been. You must be very, very good to me. Remember, after all, that I am only a child. I never loved before." "Nor I. We are both children together, and we are fortunate above most, for we have found our first love in each other." "But that is impossible!" she cried, withdrawing herself from his arms with a swift, passionate movement. "Impossible for you. You have been a sailor, and sailors, I have heard, are—" Her voice faltered and died away. "Are addicted to having a wife in every port?" he suggested. "Is that what you mean?" "Yes," she answered in a low voice. "But that is not love." He spoke authoritatively. "I have been in many ports, but I never knew a passing touch of love until I saw you that first night. Do you know, when I said good night and went away, I was almost arrested." "Arrested?" "Yes, the policeman thought I was drunk, and I was, too, with love for you." "But you said we were children, And I said it was impossible for you, and we have strayed away from the point. I said I never loved anybody but you, he replied. You are my first, my very first. And yet you have been a sailor, she objected. But that doesn't prevent me from loving you the first. And there have been women, other women. Oh. And to Martin Eden's supreme surprise, she burst into a storm of tears that took more kisses than one and many caresses to drive away. And all the while there was running through his head Kipling's line, "And the Colonel's lady and Judy O'Grady are sisters under the skins." It was true, he decided, though the novels he had read had led him to believe otherwise. His idea, for which the novels were responsible, had been that only formal proposals obtained in the upper classes. It was all right enough, down whence he had come, for youths and maidens to win each other by contact. But for the exalted personages up above, on the heights, to make love in similar fashion had seemed unthinkable. Yet the novels were wrong. Here was a proof of it. The same pressures and caresses, unaccompanied by speech, that were efficacious with the girls of the working class were equally efficacious with the girls above the working class. They were all of the same flesh, after all, sisters under their skins, and he might have known as much himself had he remembered his Spencer. As he held Ruth in his arms and soothed her, he took great consolation in the thought that the Colonel's lady and Judy O'Grady were pretty much alike under their skins. It brought Ruth closer to him, made her possible. Her dear flesh was as anybody's flesh, as his flesh. There was no bar to their marriage. Class difference was the only difference, and class was extrinsic. It could be shaken off. A slave, he had read, had risen to the Roman purple. That being so, then he could rise to Ruth. Under her purity and saintliness and culture and ethereal beauty of soul, she was, in things fundamentally human, just like Lizzie Connolly, and all Lizzie Connollys. All that was possible of them was possible of her. She could love and hate, maybe have hysterics, and she could certainly be jealous, as she was jealous now, uttering her last sobs in his arms. "Besides, I am older than you," she remarked suddenly, opening her eyes and looking at him. 3 years older. "Hush, you are only a child, and I am 40 years older than you, in experience," was his answer. In truth, they were children together, so far as love was concerned, and they were as naive and immature in the expression of their love as a pair of children, and this despite the fact that she was crammed with a university education, and that his head was full of scientific philosophy and the hard facts of life. They sat on through the passing glory of the day, talking as lovers are prone to talk, marveling at the wonder of love, and at destiny that had flung them so strangely together, and dogmatically believing that they loved to a degree never attained by lovers before. And they returned insistently, again and again, to a rehearsal of their first impressions of each other, and to hopeless attempts to analyze just precisely what they felt for each other, and how much there was of it. The cloud masses on the western horizon received the descending sun, and the circle of sky turned to rose, where the zenith glowed with the same warm color. The rosy light was all about them, flooding over them as she sang "Goodbye, Sweet Day." She sang softly, leaning in the cradle of his arm, her hands in his, their hearts in each other's hands. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. Mrs. Morse did not require a mother's intuition to read the advertisement in Ruth's face when she returned home. The flush that would not leave the cheeks told the simple story, and more eloquently did the eyes, large and bright, reflecting an unmistakable inward glory. "What has happened?" Mrs. Morse asked, having bided her time till Ruth had gone to bed. "You know?" Ruth queried with trembling lips. For reply, her mother's arm went around her, and a hand was softly caressing her hair. "He did not speak," she blurted out. "I did not intend that it should happen, and I would never have let him speak, only he didn't speak." "But if he did not speak, then nothing could have happened, could it?" "But it did just the same." "In the name of goodness, child, what are you babbling about?" Mrs. Morse was bewildered. "I don't think I know what happened after all. What did happen?" Ruth looked at her mother in surprise. "I thought you knew. Why, we're engaged, Martin and I." Mrs. Morse laughed with incredulous vexation. "No, he didn't speak," Ruth explained. "He just loved me, that was all. I was as surprised as you are. He didn't say a word. He just put his arm around me, and I was not myself. And he kissed me, and I kissed him. I couldn't help it. I just had to. And then I knew I loved him." She paused, waiting with expectancy the benediction of her mother's kiss, but Mrs. Morse was coldly silent. "It is a dreadful accident, I know," Ruth recommended with a sinking voice, "and I don't know how you will ever forgive me. But I couldn't help it. I did not dream that I loved him until that moment, and you must tell father for me." "Would it not be better not to tell your father? Let me see Martin Eden and talk with him and explain. He will understand and release you." "No, no," Ruth cried, starting up. "I do not want to be released. I love him, and love is very sweet. I am going to marry him, of course, if you will let me. We have other plans for you, Ruth dear, your father and I. Oh, no, no, no man picked out for you, or anything like that. Our plans go no farther than your marrying some man in your own station in life, a good and honorable gentleman, whom you will select yourself when you love him." "But I love Martin already," was the plaintive protest. "We would not influence your choice in any way, but you are our daughter, and we could not bear to see you make a marriage such as this. He has nothing but roughness and coarseness to offer you in exchange for all that is refined and delicate in you. He is no match for you in any way. He could not support you. We have no foolish ideas about wealth, but comfort is another matter. And our daughter should at least marry a man who can give her that, and not a penniless adventurer, a sailor, a cowboy, a smuggler, and heaven knows what else, who, in addition to everything, is harebrained and irresponsible." Ruth was silent. Every word she recognized as true. "He wastes his time over his writing, trying to accomplish what geniuses and rare men with college education sometimes accomplish. A man thinking of marriage should be preparing for marriage, but not he. As I have said, and I know you agree with me, he is irresponsible. And why should he not be? It is the way of sailors. He has never learned to be economical or temperate. The spendthrift years have marked him. It is not his fault, of course, but that does not alter his nature. And have you thought of the years of licentiousness he inevitably has lived? Have you thought of that, daughter? You know what marriage means." Ruth shuddered and clung close to her mother. "I have thought." Ruth waited a long time for the thought to frame itself. "And it is terrible. It sickens me to think of it. I told you it was a dreadful accident, my loving him, but I can't help myself. Could you help loving father? Then it is the same with me. There is something in me, in him. I never knew it was there until today, but it is there, and it makes me love him. I never thought to love him, but you see I do." She concluded, a certain faint triumph in her voice. They talked long and to little purpose, in conclusion agreeing to wait an indeterminate time without doing anything. The same conclusion was reached, a little later that night, between Mrs. Morse and her husband, after she had made due confession of the miscarriage of her plans. "It could hardly have come otherwise," was Mr. Morse's judgment. "This sailor fellow has been the only man she was in touch with. Sooner or later she was going to awaken anyway. And she did awaken, and lo, here was this sailor fellow, the only accessible man at the moment, and of course she promptly loved him, or thought she did, which amounts to the same thing. Mrs. Morse took it upon herself to work slowly and indirectly upon Ruth, rather than to combat her. There would be plenty of time for this, for Martin was not in position to marry. "Let her see all she wants of him," was Mr. Morse's advice. "The more she knows him, the less she'll love him, I wager. And give her plenty of contrast. Make a point of having young people at the house, young women and young men, all sorts of young men, clever men, men who have done something, or who are doing things, men of her own class, gentlemen. She can gauge him by them. They will show him up for what he is. And after all, he is a mere boy of 21. Ruth is no more than a child. It is calf love with the pair of them, and they will grow out of it." So the matter rested. Within the family it was accepted that Ruth and Martin were engaged, but no announcement was made. The family did not think it would ever be necessary. Also, it was tacitly understood that it was to be a long engagement. They did not ask Martin to go to work, nor to cease writing. They did not intend to encourage him to mend himself. And he aided and abetted them in their unfriendly designs, for going to work was farthest from his thoughts. "I wonder if you'll like what I've done," he said to Ruth several days later. "I've decided that boarding with my sister is too expensive, and I am going to board myself. I've rented a little room out in North Oakland, retired neighborhood and all the rest, you know, and I've bought an oil burner on which to cook." Ruth was overjoyed. The oil burner especially pleased her. "That was the way Mr. Butler began his start," she said. Martin frowned inwardly at the citation of that worthy gentleman, and went on. "I put stamps on all my manuscripts and started them off to the editors again. Then today I moved in, and tomorrow I start work." "A position!" she cried, betraying the gladness of her surprise in all her body, nestling closer to him, pressing his hand, smiling. "And you never told me. What is it?" He shook his head. "I meant that I was going to work at my writing." Her face fell, and he went on hastily. "Don't misjudge me. I am not going in this time with any iridescent ideas. It is to be a cold, prosaic, matter-of-fact business proposition. It is better than going to sea again, and I shall earn more money than any position in Oakland can bring an unskilled man. You see, this vacation I have taken has given me perspective. I haven't been working the life out of my body, and I haven't been writing, at least not for publication. All I've done has been to love you and to think. I've read some, too, but it has been part of my thinking, and I have read principally magazines. I have generalized about myself and the world, my place in it, and my chance to win to a place that will be fit for you. Also, I've been reading Spencer's Philosophy of Style, and found out a lot of what was the matter with me, or my writing, rather. And for that matter, with most of the writing that is published every month in the magazines. But the upshot of it all, of my thinking and reading and loving, is that I am going to move to Grub Street. I shall leave masterpieces alone and do hack work, jokes, paragraphs, feature articles, humorous verse, and society verse, all the rot for which there seems to be so much demand. Then there are the newspaper syndicates, and the newspaper short story syndicates, and the syndicates for the Sunday supplements. I can go ahead and hammer out the stuff they want, and earn the equivalent of a good salary by it. There are freelancers, you know, who earn as much as $400 or $500 a month. I don't care to become as they, but I'll earn a good living, and have plenty of time to myself, which I wouldn't have in any position. Then I'll have my spare time for study and for real work. In between the grind I'll try my hand at masterpieces, and I'll study and prepare myself for the writing of masterpieces. Why, I am amazed at the distance I have come already. When I first tried to write, I had nothing to write about except a few paltry experiences, which I neither understood nor appreciated. But I had no thoughts. I really didn't. I didn't even have the words with which to think. My experiences were so many meaningless pictures. But as I began to add to my knowledge and to my vocabulary, I saw something more in my experiences than mere pictures. I retained the pictures, and I found their interpretation. That was when I began to do good work, when I wrote adventure, joy, the pot, the wine of life, the jostling street, the love cycle, and the sea lyrics. I shall write more like them, and better. But I shall do it in my spare time. My feet are on the solid earth now. Hack work and income first, masterpieces afterward. Just to show you, I wrote half a dozen jokes last night for the comic weeklies, and just as I was going to bed, the thought struck me to try my hand at a triolet, a humorous one, and inside an hour I had written 4. They ought to be worth $1 apiece. $4 right there in a few afterthoughts on the way to bed. Of course, it's all valueless, just so much dull and sordid plodding. But it is no more dull and sordid than keeping books at $60 a month, adding up endless columns of meaningless figures until one dies. And furthermore, the hack work keeps me in touch with things literary, and gives me time to try bigger things. But what are the good of these bigger things, these masterpieces? Ruth demanded. You can't sell them. Oh, yes, I can, he began, but she interrupted. All those you named, and which you say yourself are good, you have not sold any of them. We can't get married on masterpieces that won't sell. Then we'll get married on triolets that will sell, he asserted stoutly, putting his arm around her and drawing a very unresponsive sweetheart toward him. Listen to this, he went on in attempted gaiety. It's not art, but it's $1. He came in when I was out. To borrow some tin was why he came in. And he went without. So I was in, and he was out. The merry lilt with which he had invested the jingle was at variance with the dejection that came into his face as he finished. He had drawn no smile from Ruth. She was looking at him in an earnest and troubled way. It may be $1, she said, but it is a jester's dollar, the fee of a clown. Don't you see, Martin? The whole thing is lowering. I want the man I love and honor to be something finer and higher than a perpetrator of jokes and doggerel. You want him to be like, say, Mr. Butler, he suggested. I know you don't like Mr. Butler, she began. Mr. Butler's all right, he interrupted. It's only his indigestion I find fault with. But to save me, I can't see any difference between writing jokes or comic verse and running a typewriter, taking dictation, or keeping sets of books. It's all a means to an end. Your theory is for me to begin with keeping books in order to become a successful lawyer or a man of business. Mine is to begin with hack work and develop into an able author. There is a difference, she insisted. What is it? Why, your good work, what you yourself call good, you can't sell. You have tried, you know that, but the editors won't buy it. Give me time, dear, he pleaded. The hack work is only makeshift, and I don't take it seriously. Give me 2 years. I shall succeed in that time, and the editors will be glad to buy my good work. I know what I am saying. I have faith in myself. I know what I have in me. I know what literature is. Now, I know the average rot that is poured out by a lot of little men, and I know that at the end of 2 years I shall be on the high road to success. As for business, I shall never succeed at it. I am not in sympathy with it. It strikes me as dull and stupid and mercenary and tricky. Anyway, I am not adapted to it. I'd never get beyond a clerkship, and how could you and I be happy on the paltry earnings of a clerk? I want the best of everything in the world for you, and the only time when I don't want it will be when there is something better. And I'm going to get it all. The income of a successful author makes Mr. Butler look cheap. A bestseller will earn anywhere between $50,000 and $100,000. Sometimes more and sometimes less, but as a rule, pretty close to those figures. She remained silent. Her disappointment was apparent. Well, he asked. I had hoped and planned otherwise. I had thought, and I still think, that the best thing for you would be to study shorthand. You already know typewriting, and go into father's office. You have a good mind, and I am confident you would succeed as a lawyer. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. That Ruth had little faith in his power as a writer did not alter her nor diminish her in Martin's eyes. In the breathing spell of the vacation he had taken, he had spent many hours in self-analysis, and thereby learned much of himself. He had discovered that he loved beauty more than fame, and that what desire he had for fame was largely for Ruth's sake. It was for this reason that his desire for fame was strong. He wanted to be great in the world's eyes, to make good, as he expressed it, in order that the woman he loved should be proud of him and deem him worthy. As for himself, he loved beauty passionately, and the joy of serving her was to him sufficient wage. And more than beauty, he loved Ruth. He considered love the finest thing in the world. It was love that worked the revolution in him, changing him from an uncouth sailor to a student and an artist. Therefore, to him, the finest and greatest of the three, greater than learning and artistry, was love. Already he had discovered that his brain went beyond Ruth's, just as it went beyond the brains of her brothers or the brain of her father. Above the things of the earth, above wealth and judgment, public opinion and applause, rising above life itself and dying on a kiss. Much of this Martin had already reasoned out, and some of it he reasoned out later. In the meantime he worked, taking no recreation except when he went to see Ruth, and living like a Spartan. He paid $2.50 a month rent for the small room he got from his Portuguese landlady, Maria Silva, a virago, a widow, hard-working and harsher-tempered, rearing her large brood of children somehow, and drowning her sorrow and fatigue at regular intervals in a gallon of the thin, sour wine that she bought from the corner grocery and saloon for 15 cents. From detesting her and her foul tongue at first, Martin grew to admire her as he observed the brave fight she made. There were but 4 rooms in the little house, 3 when Martin's was subtracted. One of these, the parlor, gay with an ingrain carpet, and dolorous with a funeral card and a death picture of one of her numerous departed babes, was kept strictly for company. The blinds were always down, and her barefooted tribe was never permitted to enter the sacred precinct save on state occasions. She cooked, and all ate, in the kitchen, where she likewise washed, starched, and ironed clothes, on all days of the week except Sunday. For her income came largely from taking in washing from her more prosperous neighbors. Remained the bedroom, small as the one occupied by Martin, into which she and her 7 little ones crowded and slept. It was an everlasting miracle to Martin how it was accomplished, and from her side of the thin partition he heard nightly every detail of the going to bed, the squalls and squabbles, the soft chattering, and the sleepy, twittering noises as of birds. Another source of income to Maria were her cows, 2 of them, which she milked night and morning, and which gained a surreptitious livelihood from vacant lots and the grass that grew on either side the public sidewalks, attended always by one or more of her ragged boys, whose watchful guardianship consisted chiefly in keeping their eyes out for the poundman. In his own small room Martin lived, slept, studied, wrote, and kept house. Before the one window, looking out on the tiny front porch, was the kitchen table that served as desk, library, and typewriting stand. The bed, against the rear wall, occupied 2/3 of the total space of the room. The table was flanked on one side by a gaudy bureau, manufactured for profit and not for service, the thin veneer of which was shed day by day. This bureau stood in the corner, and in the opposite corner, on the table's other flank, was the kitchen. The oil stove on a dry goods box, inside of which were dishes and cooking utensils, a shelf on the wall for provisions, and a bucket of water on the floor. Martin had to carry his water from the kitchen sink, there being no tap in his room. On days when there was much steam to his cooking, the harvest of veneer from the bureau was unusually generous. Over the bed, hoisted by a tackle to the ceiling, was his bicycle. At first he had tried to keep it in the basement, but the tribe of Silva, loosening the bearings and puncturing the tires, had driven him out. Next he attempted the tiny front porch, until a howling southeaster drenched the wheel a night long. Then he had retreated with it to his room and slung it aloft. A small closet contained his clothes and the books he had accumulated, and for which there was no room on the table or under the table. Hand in hand with reading, he had developed the habit of making notes, and so copiously did he make them that there would have been no existence for him in the confined quarters had he not rigged several clotheslines across the room on which the notes were hung. Even so, he was crowded until navigating the room was a difficult task. He could not open the door without first closing the closet door, and vice versa. It was impossible for him anywhere to traverse the room in a straight line. To go from the door to the head of the bed was a zigzag course that he was never quite able to accomplish in the dark without collisions. Having settled the difficulty of the conflicting doors, he had to steer sharply to the right to avoid the kitchen. Next, he sheered to the left to escape the foot of the bed, but this sheer, if too generous, brought him against the corner of the table. With a sudden twitch and lurch, he terminated the sheer and bore off to the right along a sort of canal, one bank of which was the bed and the other the table. When the one chair in the room was at its usual place before the table, the canal was unnavigable. When the chair was not in use, it reposed on top of the bed, though sometimes he sat on the chair when cooking, reading a book while the water boiled, and even becoming skillful enough to manage a paragraph or two while steak was frying. Also, so small was the little corner that constituted the kitchen, he was able, sitting down, to reach anything he needed. In fact, it was expedient to cook sitting down. Standing up, he was too often in his own way. In conjunction with a perfect stomach that could digest anything, he possessed knowledge of the various foods that were at the same time nutritious and cheap. Pea soup was a common article in his diet, as well as potatoes and beans, the latter large and brown and cooked in Mexican style. Rice, cooked as American housewives never cook it and can never learn to cook it, appeared on Martin's table at least once a day. Dried fruits were less expensive than fresh, and he had usually a pot of them, cooked and ready at hand, for they took the place of butter on his bread. Occasionally he graced his table with a piece of round steak, or with a soup bone. Coffee, without cream or milk, he had twice a day, in the evening substituting tea, but both coffee and tea were excellently cooked. There was need for him to be economical. His vacation had consumed nearly all he had earned in the laundry, and he was so far from his market that weeks must elapse before he could hope for the first returns from his hack work. Except at such times as he saw Ruth, or dropped in to see his sister Gertrude, he lived a recluse, in each day accomplishing at least 3 days' labor of ordinary men. He slept a scant 5 hours, and only one with a constitution of iron could have held himself down, as Martin did, day after day, to 19 consecutive hours of toil. He never lost a moment. On the looking-glass were lists of definitions and pronunciations. When shaving or dressing or combing his hair, he conned these lists over. Similar lists were on the wall over the oil stove, and they were similarly conned when he was engaged in cooking or in washing the dishes. New lists continually displaced the old ones. Every strange or partly familiar word encountered in his reading was immediately jotted down, and later, when a sufficient number had been accumulated, were typed and pinned to the wall or looking-glass. He even carried them in his pockets and reviewed them at odd moments on the street, or while waiting in butcher shop or grocery to be served. He went farther in the matter. Reading the works of men who had arrived, he noted every result achieved by them, and worked out the tricks by which they had been achieved, the tricks of narrative, of exposition, of style, the points of view, the contrasts, the epigrams. Of all these he made lists for study. He did not ape. He sought principles. He drew up lists of effective and fetching mannerisms, till out of many such, culled from many writers, he was able to induce the general principle of mannerism, and, thus equipped, to cast about for new and original ones of his own, and to weigh and measure and appraise them properly. In similar manner he collected lists of strong phrases, the phrases of living language, phrases that bit like acid and scorched like flame, or that glowed and were mellow and luscious in the midst of the arid desert of common speech. He sought always for the principle that lay behind and beneath. He wanted to know how the thing was done. After that he could do it for himself. He was not content with the fair face of beauty. He dissected beauty in his crowded little bedroom laboratory, where cooking smells alternated with the outer bedlam of the Silva tribe, and, having dissected and learned the anatomy of beauty, he was nearer being able to create beauty itself. He was so made that he could work only with understanding. He could not work blindly, in the dark, ignorant of what he was producing, and trusting to chance and the star of his genius, that the effect produced should be right and fine. He had no patience with chance effects. He wanted to know why and how. His was deliberate creative genius, and, before he began a story or poem, the thing itself was already alive in his brain, with the end in sight and the means of realizing that end in his conscious possession. Otherwise, the effort was doomed to failure. On the other hand, he appreciated the chance effects in words and phrases that came lightly and easily into his brain, and that later stood all tests of beauty and power, and developed tremendous and incommunicable connotations. Before such he bowed down and marveled, knowing that they were beyond the deliberate creation of any man. And no matter how much he dissected beauty in search of the principles that underlie beauty and make beauty possible, he was aware always of the innermost mystery of beauty, to which he did not penetrate, and to which no man had ever penetrated. He knew full well, from his Spencer, that man can never attain ultimate knowledge of anything, and that the mystery of beauty was no less than that of life, nay, more that the fibres of beauty and life were intertwisted, and that he himself was but a bit of the same non-understandable fabric, twisted of sunshine and stardust and wonder. In fact, it was when filled with these thoughts that he wrote his essay entitled Stardust, in which he had his fling, not at the principles of criticism, but at the principal critics. It was brilliant, deep, philosophical, and deliciously touched with laughter. Also, it was promptly rejected by the magazines as often as it was submitted. But having cleared his mind of it, he went serenely on his way. It was a habit he developed, of incubating and maturing his thought upon a subject, and of then rushing into the typewriter with it. That it did not see print was a matter of small moment with him. The writing of it was the culminating act of a long mental process, the drawing together of scattered threads of thought, and the final generalizing upon all the data with which his mind was burdened. To write such an article was the conscious effort by which he freed his mind and made it ready for fresh material and problems. It was in a way akin to that common habit of men and women troubled by real or fancied grievances, who periodically and volubly break their long-suffering silence and have their say till the last word is said. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. The weeks passed. Martin ran out of money, and publishers' checks were far away as ever. All his important manuscripts had come back and been started out again, and his hack work fared no better. His little kitchen was no longer graced with a variety of foods. Caught in the pinch with a part sack of rice and a few pounds of dried apricots, rice and apricots was his menu 3 times a day for 5 days hand-running. Then he started to realize on his credit. The Portuguese grocer, to whom he had hitherto paid cash, called a halt when Martin's bill reached the magnificent total of $3.85. "For you see," said the grocer, You no catcha de work, I losa de mon. And Martin could reply nothing. There was no way of explaining. It was not true business principle to allow credit to a strong-bodied young fellow of the working class who was too lazy to work. You catcha de job, I let you have more de grub, the grocer assured Martin. No job, no grub. That de business. And then, to show that it was purely business foresight and not prejudice, have de drink on de house. Good friends, just de same. So Martin drank in his easy way to show that he was good friends with the house, and then went supperless to bed. The fruit store, where Martin had bought his vegetables, was run by an American whose business principles were so weak that he let Martin run a bill of $5 before stopping his credit. The baker stopped at $2 and the butcher at $4. Martin added his debts and found that he was possessed of a total credit in all the world of $14.85. He was up with his typewriter rent, but he estimated that he could get 2 months' credit on that, which would be $8. When that occurred, he would have exhausted all possible credit. The last purchase from the fruit store had been a sack of potatoes, and for a week he had potatoes, and nothing but potatoes, 3 times a day. An occasional dinner at Ruth's helped to keep strength in his body, though he found it tantalizing enough to refuse further helping when his appetite was raging at sight of so much food spread before it. Now and again, though afflicted with secret shame, he dropped in at his sister's at mealtime and ate as much as he dared, more than he dared at the Morse table. Day by day he worked on, and day by day the postman delivered to him rejected manuscripts. He had no money for stamps, so the manuscripts accumulated in a heap under the table. Came a day when for 40 hours he had not tasted food. He could not hope for a meal at Ruth's, for she was away at San Rafael on a 2 weeks' visit, and for very shame's sake he could not go to his sister's. To cap misfortune, the postman, in his afternoon round, brought him 5 returned manuscripts. Then it was that Martin wore his overcoat down into Oakland and came back without it, but with $5 tinkling in his pocket. He paid $1 each on account to the 4 tradesmen, and in his kitchen fried steak and onions, made coffee, and stewed a large pot of prunes. And, having dined, he sat down at his table desk and completed before midnight an essay which he entitled "The Dignity of Usury." Having typed it out, he flung it under the table, for there had been nothing left from the $5 with which to buy stamps. Later on he pawned his watch, and later his wheel, reducing the amount available for food by putting stamps on all his manuscripts and sending them out. He was disappointed by his hack work. Nobody cared to buy. He compared it with what he found in the newspapers, weeklies, and cheap magazines, and decided that his was better, far better, than the average, yet it would not sell. Then he discovered that most of the newspapers printed a great deal of what was called plate stuff, and he got the address of the association that furnished it. His own work that he sent in was returned, along with a stereotyped slip, informing him that the staff supplied all the copy that was needed. In one of the great juvenile periodicals, he noted whole columns of incident and anecdote. Here was a chance. His paragraphs were returned, and though he tried repeatedly, he never succeeded in placing one. Later on, when it no longer mattered, he learned that the associate editors and sub-editors augmented their weekly salaries by supplying those paragraphs themselves. The comic weeklies returned his jokes and humorous verse, and the light society verse he wrote for the large magazines found no abiding place. Then there was the newspaper storiette. He knew that he could write better ones than were published. Managing to obtain the addresses of 2 newspaper syndicates, he deluged them with storiettes. When he had written 20 and failed to place one of them, he ceased. And yet, from day to day, he read storiettes in the dailies and weeklies, scores and scores of storiettes, not one of which would compare with his. In his despondency, he concluded that he had no judgment whatever, that he was hypnotized by what he wrote, and that he was a self-deluded pretender. The inhuman editorial machine ran smoothly as ever. He folded the stamps in with his manuscript, dropped it into the letter-box, and from 3 weeks to a month afterward, the postman came up the steps and handed him the manuscript. Surely there were no live, warm editors at the other end. It was all the wheels and cogs and oil cups, a clever mechanism operated by automatons. He reached stages of despair wherein he doubted if editors existed at all. He had never received a sign of the existence of one, and from absence of judgment in rejecting all he wrote, it seemed plausible that editors were myths, manufactured and maintained by office boys, typesetters, and pressmen. The hours he spent with Ruth were the only happy ones he had, and they were not all happy. He was afflicted always with a gnawing restlessness, more tantalizing than in the old days before he possessed her love. For now that he did possess her love, the possession of her was far away as ever. He had asked for 2 years, time was flying, and he was achieving nothing. Again, he was always conscious of the fact that she did not approve what he was doing. She did not say so directly, yet indirectly she let him understand it as clearly and definitely as she could have spoken it. It was not resentment with her, but disapproval, though less sweet-natured women might have resented where she was no more than disappointed. Her disappointment lay in that this man she had taken to mold refused to be molded. To a certain extent she had found his clay plastic, then it had developed stubbornness, declining to be shaped in the image of her father or of Mr. Butler. What was great and strong in him she missed, or, worse yet, misunderstood. This man, whose clay was so plastic that he could live in any number of pigeonholes of human existence, she thought willful and most obstinate, because she could not shape him to live in her pigeonhole, which was the only one she knew. She could not follow the flights of his mind, and when his brain got beyond her, she deemed him erratic. Nobody else's brain ever got beyond her. She could always follow her father and mother, her brothers and Olney. Wherefore, when she could not follow Martin, she believed the fault lay with him. It was the old tragedy of insularity trying to serve as mentor to the universal. "You worship at the shrine of the established," he told her once, in a discussion they had over Praps and Vanderwater. "I grant that as authorities to quote they are most excellent, the 2 foremost literary critics in the United States. Every schoolteacher in the land looks up to Vanderwater as the dean of American criticism. Yet I read his stuff, and it seems to me the perfection of the felicitous expression of the inane. Why, he is no more than a ponderous bromide, thanks to Gelett Burgess. And Praps is no better. His Hemlock Mosses, for instance, is beautifully written. Not a comma is out of place, and the tone, is lofty, so lofty. He is the best paid critic in the United States. Though, heaven forbid, he's not a critic at all. They do criticism better in England. But the point is, they sound the popular note, and they sound it so beautifully and morally and contentedly. Their reviews remind me of a British Sunday. They are the popular mouthpieces. They back up your professors of English, and your professors of English back them up, and there isn't an original idea in any of their skulls. They know only the established. In fact, they are the established. They are weak-minded, and the established impresses itself upon them as easily as the name of the brewery is impressed on a beer bottle. And their function is to catch all the young fellows attending the university, to drive out of their minds any glimmering originality that may chance to be there, and to put upon them the stamp of the established." "I think I am nearer the truth," she replied. "When I stand by the established than you are, raging around like an iconoclastic South Sea Islander." "It was the missionary who did the image-breaking," he laughed. "And unfortunately, all the missionaries are off among the heathen, so there are none left at home to break those old images, Mr. Vanderwater and Mr. Praps." "And the college professors as well?" she added. He shook his head emphatically. "No, the science professors should live. They're really great. But it would be a good deed to break the heads of 9/10 of the English professors. little microscopic-minded parrots, which was rather severe on the professors, but which to Ruth was blasphemy. She could not help but measure the professors, neat, scholarly, in fitting clothes, speaking in well-modulated voices, breathing of culture and refinement, with this almost indescribable young fellow, whom somehow she loved, whose clothes never would fit him, whose heavy muscles told of damning toil, who grew excited when he talked, substituting abuse for calm statement and passionate utterance for cool self-possession. They at least earned good salaries and were, yes, she compelled herself to face it, were gentlemen, while he could not earn a penny, and he was not as they. She did not weigh Martin's words, nor judge his argument by them. Her conclusion that his argument was wrong was reached, unconsciously, it is true, by a comparison of externals. They, the professors, were right in their literary judgments because they were successes. Martin's literary judgments were wrong because he could not sell his wares. To use his own phrase, they made good, and he did not make good. And besides, it did not seem reasonable that he should be right, he who had stood, so short a time before, in that same living room, blushing and awkward, acknowledging his introduction, looking fearfully about him, at the bric-a-brac his swinging shoulders threatened to break, asking how long since Swinburne died, and boastfully announcing that he had read Excelsior and the Psalm of Life. Unwittingly, Ruth herself proved his point that she worshipped the established. Martin followed the processes of her thoughts, but forbore to go farther. He did not love her for what she thought of Praps and Van der Water and English professors, and he was coming to realize with increasing conviction that he possessed brain areas and stretches of knowledge which she could never comprehend nor know existed. In music she thought him unreasonable, and in the matter of opera not only unreasonable but wilfully perverse. "How did you like it?" she asked him one night on the way home from the opera. It was a night when he had taken her at the expense of a month's rigid economizing on food. After vainly waiting for him to speak about it, herself still tremulous and stirred by what she had just seen and heard, she had asked the question. "I liked the overture," was his answer. "It was splendid." "Yes, but the opera itself." "That was splendid too. That is, the orchestra was, though I'd have enjoyed it more if those jumping jacks had kept quiet or gone off the stage." Ruth was aghast. "You don't mean Tetralani or Barillo?" she queried. "All of them, the whole kit and crew." "But they are great artists," she protested. "They spoiled the music just the same, with their antics and unrealities." "But don't you like Barillo's voice?" Ruth asked. "He is next to Caruso, they say." "Of course I liked him, and I like Tetralani even better. Her voice is exquisite, or at least I think so." But, Ruth stammered, "I don't know what you mean then. You admire their voices, yet you say they spoiled the music." "Precisely that. I'd give anything to hear them in concert, and I'd give even a bit more not to hear them when the orchestra is playing. I'm afraid I am a hopeless realist. Great singers are not great actors. To hear Barillo sing a love passage with the voice of an angel, and to hear Tetralani reply like another angel, and to hear it all accompanied by a perfect orgy of glowing and colorful music, is ravishing, most ravishing. I do not admit it. I assert it. But the whole effect is spoiled when I look at them. At Tetralani, 5 feet 10 in her stocking feet, and weighing 190 pounds, and at Barillo, a scant 5 feet 4, greasy-featured, with the chest of a squat, undersized blacksmith, and at the pair of them, attitudinizing, clasping their breasts, flinging their arms in the air like demented creatures in an asylum. And when I am expected to accept all this as the faithful illusion of a love scene between a slender and beautiful princess and a handsome romantic young prince, why, I can't accept it, that's all. It's rot, it's absurd, it's unreal. That's what's the matter with it. It's not real. Don't tell me that anybody in this world ever made love that way. Why, if I'd made love to you in such fashion, you'd have boxed my ears." "But you misunderstand," Ruth protested. Every form of art has its limitations. She was busy recalling a lecture she had heard at the university on the conventions of the arts. In painting, there are only 2 dimensions to the canvas, yet you accept the illusion of 3 dimensions, which the art of the painter enables him to throw into the canvas. In writing, again, the author must be omnipotent. You accept as perfectly legitimate the author's account of the secret thoughts of the heroine, and yet at the same time you know that the heroine was alone when thinking these thoughts, and that neither the author nor anyone else was capable of hearing them. And so with the stage, with sculpture, with opera, with every form of art, certain irreconcilable things must be accepted. Yes, I understand that, Martin answered. All the arts have their conventions. Ruth was surprised at his use of the word. It was as if he had studied at the university himself, instead of being ill-equipped from browsing at haphazard through the books in the library. But even the conventions must be real. Trees, painted on flat cardboard and stuck up on each side of the stage, we accept as a forest. It is a real enough convention. But, on the other hand, we would not accept a sea scene as a forest. We can't do it. It violates our senses. Nor would you, or rather should you, accept the ravings and writhings and agonized contortions of those 2 lunatics tonight as a convincing portrayal of love. But you don't hold yourself superior to all the judges of music, she protested. No, no, not for a moment. I merely maintain my right as an individual. I have just been telling you what I think, in order to explain why the elephantine gambols of Madame Tetralini spoil the orchestra for me. The world's judges of music may all be right, but I am I, and I won't subordinate my taste to the unanimous judgment of mankind. If I don't like a thing, I don't like it, that's all. And there is no reason under the sun why I should ape a liking for it, just because the majority of my fellow creatures like it, or make believe they like it. I can't follow the fashion in things I like or dislike. But music, you know, is a matter of training, Ruth argued, and opera is even more a matter of training. May it not be that I am not trained in opera? He dashed in. She nodded. The very thing, he agreed. And I consider I am fortunate in not having been caught when I was young. If I had, I could have wept sentimental tears tonight, and the clownish antics of that precious pair would have but enhanced the beauty of their voices and the beauty of the accompanying orchestra. You are right. It's mostly a matter of training, and I am too old now. I must have the real thing or nothing. An illusion that won't convince me is a palpable lie, and that's what grand opera is to me when little Barillo throws a fit, clutches mighty Tetralini in his arms, also in a fit, and tells her how passionately he adores her. Again, Ruth measured his thoughts by comparison of externals, and in accordance with her belief in the established. Who was he, that he should be right and all the cultured world wrong? His words and thoughts made no impression upon her. She was too firmly entrenched in the established to have any sympathy with revolutionary ideas. She had always been used to music, and she had enjoyed opera ever since she was a child, and all her world had enjoyed it too. Then by what right did Martin Eden emerge, as he had so recently emerged, with his ragtime and working-class songs, and pass judgment on the world's music? She was vexed with him, and as she walked beside him she had a vague feeling of outrage. At the best, in her most charitable frame of mind, she considered the statement of his views to be a caprice, an erratic and uncalled-for prank. But when he took her in his arms at the door, and kissed her good night in tender lover fashion, she forgot everything in the outrush of her own love to him. And later, on a sleepless pillow, she puzzled, as she had often puzzled of late, as to how it was that she loved so strange a man, and loved him despite the disapproval of her people. And next day Martin Eden cast hack work aside, and at white heat hammered out an essay to which he gave the title, The Philosophy of Illusion. A stamp started it on its travels, but it was destined to receive many stamps, and to be started on many travels in the months that followed. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. Maria Silva was poor, and all the ways of poverty were clear to her. Poverty to Ruth was a word signifying a not nice condition of existence. That was her total knowledge on the subject. She knew Martin was poor, and his condition she associated in her mind with the boyhood of Abraham Lincoln, of Mr. Butler, and of other men who had become successes. Also, while aware that poverty was anything but delectable, she had a comfortable middle-class feeling that poverty was salutary, that it was a sharp spur that urged on to success all men who were not degraded and hopeless drudges. So that her knowledge that Martin was so poor that he had pawned his watch and overcoat did not disturb her. She even considered it the hopeful side of the situation, believing that sooner or later it would arouse him and compel him to abandon his writing. Ruth never read hunger in Martin's face, which had grown lean and had enlarged the slight hollows in the cheeks. In fact, she marked the change in his face with satisfaction. It seemed to refine him, to remove from him much of the dross of flesh and the too animal-like vigor that lured her while she detested it. Sometimes, when with her, she noted an unusual brightness in his eyes, and she admired it, for it made him appear more the poet and the scholar, the things he would have liked to be, and which she would have liked him to be. But Maria Silva read a different tale in the hollow cheeks and the burning eyes, and she noted the changes in them from day to day, by them following the ebb and flow of his fortunes. She saw him leave the house with his overcoat, and return without it, though the day was chill and raw, and promptly she saw his cheeks fill out slightly, and the fire of hunger leave his eyes. In the same way she had seen his wheel and watch go, and after each event she had seen his vigor bloom again. Likewise she watched his toils, and knew the measure of the midnight oil he burned, work. She knew that he outdid her, though his work was of a different order, and she was surprised to behold that the less food he had, the harder he worked. On occasion, in a casual sort of way, when she thought hunger pinched hardest, she would send him in a loaf of new baking, awkwardly covering the act with banter to the effect that it was better than he could bake. And again she would send one of her toddlers into him with a great pitcher of hot soup, debating inwardly the while whether she was justified in taking it from the mouths of her own flesh and blood. Nor was Martin ungrateful, knowing as he did the lives of the poor, and that if ever in the world there was charity, this was it. On a day when she had filled her brood with what was left in the house, Maria invested her last 15 cents in a gallon of cheap wine. Martin, coming into her kitchen to fetch water, was invited to sit down and drink. He drank her very good health, and in return she drank his. Then she drank to prosperity in his undertakings, and he drank to the hope that James Grant would show up and pay for his washing. James Grant was a journeyman carpenter who did not always pay his bills, and who owed Maria $3. Both Maria and Martin drank the sour new wine on empty stomachs, and it went swiftly to their heads. Utterly differentiated creatures that they were lonely in their misery, and though the misery was tacitly ignored, it was the bond that drew them together. Maria was amazed to learn that he had been in the Azores, where she had lived until she was 11. She was doubly amazed that he had been in the Hawaiian Islands, whither she had migrated from the Azores with her people. But her amazement passed all bounds when he told her he had been on Maui, the particular island whereon she had attained womanhood and married. Kahului, where she had first met her husband. He, Martin, had been there twice. Yes, she remembered the sugar steamers, and he had been on them. Well, it was a small world. And Wailuku, that place too. Did he know the head Luna of the plantation? Yes, and had had a couple of drinks with him. And so they reminisced and drowned their hunger in the raw, sour wine. To Martin, the future did not seem so dim. Success trembled just before him. He was on the verge of clasping it. Then he studied the deep-lined face of the toil-worn woman before him, remembered her soups and loaves of new baking, and felt spring up in him the warmest gratitude and philanthropy. "Maria," he exclaimed suddenly, "what would you like to have?" She looked at him, bepuzzled. "What would you like to have now, right now, if you could get it?" "Shoe all around for de childs. 7 pair de shoe." "You shall have them," he announced, while she nodded her head gravely. "But I mean a big wish, something big that you want." Her eyes sparkled good-naturedly. He was choosing to make fun with her, Maria, with whom few made fun these days. "Think hard," he cautioned, just as she was opening her mouth to speak. "All a right," she answered. "I think a da hard. I like a da house, dis house, all mine. No pay a da rent, $7 da month." "You shall have it," he granted, "and in a short time. Now wish the great wish. Make believe I am God, and I say to you, anything you want you can have. Then you wish that thing, and I listen." Maria considered solemnly for a space. "You no 'fraid?" she asked warningly. "No, no," he laughed. "I'm not afraid. Go ahead." "Most verra big," she warned again. "All right, fire away. Well, den." She drew a big breath like a child, as she voiced to the uttermost all she cared to demand of life. "I like to have one milk-a ranch, good milk-a ranch, plenty cow, plenty land, plenty grass. I like to have near San Leanne. My sister live a dere. I sell a de milk in Oakland. I make a de plenty mon. Joe and Nick no run a de cow. They go a de school. Bimeby make a de good engineer, work a de railroad. Yes, I like a de milk-a ranch." She paused and regarded Martin with twinkling eyes. "You shall have it," he answered promptly. She nodded her head and touched her lips courteously to the wine-glass, and to the giver of the gift she knew she would never be given. His heart was right, and in her own heart she appreciated his intention as much as if the gift had gone with it. "No, Maria," he went on, "Nick and Joe won't have to peddle milk, and all the kids can go to school and wear shoes the whole year round. It will be a first-class milk ranch, everything complete. There will be a house to live in, and a stable for the horses, and cow barns, of course. There will be chickens, pigs, vegetables, fruit trees, and everything like that. And there will be enough cows to pay for a hired man or two. Then you won't have anything to do but take care of the children. For that matter, if you find a good man, you can marry and take it easy while he runs the ranch." And from such largesse, dispensed from his future, Martin turned and took his one good suit of clothes to the pawnshop. His plight was desperate for him to do this, for it cut him off from Ruth. He had no second-best suit that was presentable, and though he could go to the butcher and the baker, and even on occasion to his sister's, it was beyond all daring to dream of entering the Morse home so disreputably apparelled. He toiled on, miserable and well-nigh hopeless. It began to appear to him that the second battle was lost, and that he would have to go to work. In doing this he would satisfy everybody, the grocer, his sister, Ruth, and even Maria, to whom he owed a month's room rent. He was 2 months behind with his typewriter, and the agency was clamoring for payment or for the return of the machine. In desperation, all but ready to surrender, to make a truce with fate until he could get a fresh start, he took the civil service examinations for the railway mail. To his surprise, he passed first. The job was assured, though when the call would come to enter upon his duties, nobody knew. It was at this time, at the lowest ebb, that the smooth-running editorial machine broke down. A cog must have slipped, or an oil cup run dry, for the postman brought him one morning a short, thin envelope. Martin glanced at the upper left-hand corner and read the name and address of the Transcontinental Monthly. His heart gave a great leap, and he suddenly felt faint, the sinking feeling accompanied by a strange trembling of the knees. He staggered into his room and sat down on the bed, the envelope still unopened, and in that moment came understanding to him how people suddenly fall dead upon receipt of extraordinarily good news. Of course, this was good news. There was no manuscript in that thin envelope, therefore it was an acceptance. He knew the story in the hands of the Transcontinental. It was The Ring of Bells, one of his horror stories, and it was an even 5,000 words. And, since first-class magazines always paid on acceptance, there was a check inside. 2 cents a word, $20 1,000. The check must be for $100. $100. As he tore the envelope open, every item of all his debts surged in his brain. $3.85 to the grocer, butcher $4 flat, baker $2, fruit store $5, total $14.85. Then there was room rent $2.50, another month in advance $2.50, 2 months typewriter $8, a month in advance $4, total $31.85. And finally to be added his pledges plus interest with the pawnbroker. Watch $5.50, overcoat $5.50, wheel $7.75, suit of clothes $5.50, 60% interest, but what did it matter? Grand total $56.10. He saw, as if visible in the air before him, in illuminated figures, the whole sum, and the subtraction that followed and that gave a remainder of $43.90. When he had squared every debt, redeemed every pledge, he would still have jingling in his pockets a princely $43.90. And on top of that, he would have a month's rent paid in advance on the typewriter and on the room. By this time, he had drawn the single sheet of typewritten letter out and spread it open. There was no check. He peered into the envelope, held it to the light, but could not trust his eyes, and in trembling haste tore the envelope apart. There was no check. He read the letter, skimming it line by line, dashing through the editor's praise of his story to the meat of the letter, the statement why the check had not been sent. He found no such statement, but he did find that which made him suddenly wilt. The letter slid from his hand. His eyes went lackluster, and he lay back on the pillow, pulling the blanket about him and up to his chin. $5 for The Ring of Bells. $5 for 5,000 words. Instead of 2 cents a word, 10 words for a cent. And the editor had praised it too, and he would receive the check when the story was published. Then it was all poppycock. 2 cents a word for minimum rate and payment upon acceptance. It was a lie, and it had led him astray. He would never have attempted to write had he known that. He would have gone to work for Ruth. He went back to the day he first attempted to write, and was appalled at the enormous waste of time, and all for 10 words for a cent. And the other high rewards of writers that he had read about must be lies too. His second-hand ideas of authorship were wrong, for here was the proof of it. The Transcontinental sold for 25 cents, and its dignified and artistic cover proclaimed it as among the first-class magazines. It was a staid, respectable magazine, and it had been published continuously since long before he was born. Why, on the outside cover were printed every month the words of one of the world's great writers, words proclaiming the inspired mission of the Transcontinental by a star of literature, whose first coruscations had appeared inside those self-same covers. And the high and lofty, heaven-inspired Transcontinental paid $5 for 5,000 words. The great writer had recently died in a foreign land, in dire poverty, Martin remembered, which was not to be wondered at, considering the magnificent pay authors receive. Well, he had taken the bait, the newspaper lies about writers and their pay, and he had wasted 2 years over it. But he would disgorge the bait now. Not another line would he ever write. He would do what Ruth wanted him to do, what everybody wanted him to do, get a job. The thought of going to work reminded him of Joe, tramping through the land of nothing to do. Martin heaved a great sigh of envy. The reaction of 19 hours a day for many days was strong upon him. But then Joe was not in love, had none of the responsibilities of love, and he could afford to loaf through the land of do-nothing. He, Martin, had something to work for, and go to work he would. He would start out early next morning to hunt a job, and he would let Ruth know, too, that he had mended his ways and was willing to go into her father's office. $5 for 5,000 words. 10 words for a cent, the market price for art. The disappointment of it, the lie of it, the infamy of it, were uppermost in his thoughts. And under his closed eyelids, in fiery figures, burned the $3.85 he owed the grocer. He shivered and was aware of an aching in his bones. The small of his back ached especially. His head ached, the top of it ached, the back of it ached, the brains inside of it ached, and seemed to be swelling, while the ache over his brows was intolerable. And beneath the brows, planted under his lids, was the merciless $3.85. He opened his eyes to escape it, but the white light of the room seemed to sear the balls, and forced him to close his eyes, when the $3.85 confronted him again. $5 for 5,000 words, 10 words a cent. That particular thought took up its residence in his brain, and he could no more escape it than he could the $3.85 under his eyelids. A change seemed to come over the latter, and he watched curiously till $2 burned in its stead. Ah, he thought, that was the baker. The next sum that appeared was $2.50. It puzzled him, and he pondered it as if life and death hung on the solution. He owed somebody $2.50, that was certain, but who was it? To find it was the task set him by an imperious and malignant universe, and he wandered through the endless corridors of his mind, opening all manner of lumber rooms and chambers, stored with odds and ends of memories and knowledge, as he vainly sought the answer. After several centuries it came to him easily, without effort, that it was Maria. With a great relief he turned his soul to the screen of torment under his lids. He had solved the problem, now he could rest. But no, the $2.50 faded away, and in its place burned $8. Who was that? He must go the dreary round of his mind again and find out. How long he was gone on this quest he did not know, and after what seemed an enormous lapse of time, he was called back to himself by a knock at the door, and by Maria's asking if he was sick. He replied in a muffled voice he did not recognize, saying that he was merely taking a nap. He was surprised when he noted the darkness of night in the room. He had received the letter at 2 in the afternoon, and he realized that he was sick. Then the $8 began to smolder under his lids again, and he returned himself to servitude. But he grew cunning. There was no need for him to wander through his mind. He had been a fool. He pulled a lever and made his mind revolve about him, a monstrous wheel of fortune, a merry-go-round of memory, a revolving sphere of wisdom. Faster and faster it revolved, until its vortex sucked him in, and he was flung whirling through black chaos. Quite naturally he found himself at a mangle, feeding starched cuffs. But as he fed, he noticed figures printed in the cuffs. It was a new way of marking linen, he thought, until, looking closer, he saw $3.85 on one of the cuffs. Then it came to him that it was the grocer's bill, and that these were the bills flying around on the drum of the mangle. A crafty idea came to him. He would throw the bills on the floor, and so escape paying them. No sooner thought than done, and he crumpled the cuffs spitefully as he flung them upon an unusually dirty floor. Ever the heap grew, and though each bill was duplicated 1,000 times, he found only one for $2.50, which was what he owed Maria. That meant that Maria would not press for payment, and he resolved, generously, that it would be the only one he would pay. So he began searching through the cast-out heap for hers. He sought it desperately, for ages, and was still searching when the manager of the hotel entered, the fat Dutchman. His face blazed with wrath, and he shouted in stentorian tones that echoed down the universe, "I shall deduct the cost of those cuffs from your wages." The pile of cuffs grew into a mountain, and Martin knew that he was doomed to toil for 1,000 years to pay for them. Well, there was nothing left to do but kill the manager and burn down the laundry. But the big Dutchman frustrated him, seizing him by the nape of the neck and dancing him up and down. He danced him over the ironing tables, the stove, and the mangles, and out of the washroom and over the wringer and washer. Martin was danced until his teeth rattled and his head ached, and he marveled that the Dutchman was so strong. And then he found himself before the mangle, this time receiving the cuffs an editor of a magazine was feeding from the other side. Each cuff was a check, and Martin went over them anxiously, in a fever of expectation, but they were all blanks. He stood there and received the blanks for 1,000,000 years or so, never letting one go by for fear it might be filled out. At last he found it. With trembling fingers he held it to the light. It was for $5. "Ha, ha!" laughed the editor across the mangle. "Well then, I shall kill you," Martin said. He went out into the washroom to get the axe, and found Joe starching manuscripts. He tried to make him desist, then swung the axe for him. But the weapon remained poised in mid-air, for Martin found himself back in the ironing room, in the midst of a snowstorm. No, it was not snow that was falling, but checks of large denomination, the smallest not less than $1,000. He began to collect them and sort them out, in packages of 100, tying each package securely with twine. He looked up from his task and saw Joe standing before him, juggling flat irons, starched shirts, and manuscripts. Now and again he reached out and added a bundle of checks to the flying miscellany that soared through the roof and out of sight in a tremendous circle. Martin struck at him, but he seized the axe and added it to the flying circle. Then he plucked Martin and added him. Martin went up through the roof, clutching at manuscripts, so that by the time he came down, he had a large armful. But no sooner down than up again, and a second and a third time, and countless times he flew around the circle. From far off he could hear a childish treble singing, "Waltz me around again, Willie, around, around, around." He recovered the axe in the midst of the Milky Way of checks, starched shirts, and manuscripts, and prepared, when he came down, to kill Joe. But he did not come down. Instead, at 2 in the morning, Maria, having heard his groans through the thin partition, came into his room to put hot flat irons against his body and damp cloths upon his aching eyes. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. Martin Eden did not go out to hunt for a job in the morning. It was late afternoon before he came out of his delirium and gazed with aching eyes about the room. Mary, one of the tribe of Silva, 8 years old, keeping watch, raised a screech at sight of his returning consciousness. Maria hurried into the room from the kitchen. She put her work-calloused hand upon his hot forehead and felt his pulse. "You like to eat?" she asked. He shook his head. Eating was farthest from his desire, and he wondered that he should ever have been hungry in his life. "I'm sick, Maria," he said weakly. "What is it? Do you know?" "Grip," she answered. 2 or 3 days, you alla da right. Better you no eat now. Bimeby plenty can eat. Tomorrow can eat maybe." Martin was not used to sickness, and when Maria and her little girl left him, he essayed to get up and dress. By a supreme exertion of will, with rearing brain and eyes that ached so that he could not keep them open, he managed to get out of bed, only to be left stranded by his senses upon the table. Half an hour later he managed to regain the bed, where he was content to lie with closed eyes and analyze his various pains and weaknesses. Maria came in several times to change the cold cloths on his forehead. Otherwise she left him in peace, too wise to vex him with chatter. This moved him to gratitude, and he murmured to himself, "Maria, you get a da milk a ranch all right." Then he remembered his long-buried past of yesterday. It seemed like a lifetime since he had received that letter from the Transcontinental, a lifetime since it was all over and done with and a new page turned. He had shot his bolt, and shot it hard, and now he was down on his back. If he hadn't starved himself, he wouldn't have been caught by La Grippe. He had been run down, and he had not had the strength to throw off the germ of disease which had invaded his system. This was what resulted. "What does it profit a man to write a whole library and lose his own life?" he demanded aloud. "This is no place for me. No more literature in mine. Me for the counting-house and ledger, the monthly salary, and the little home with Ruth." 2 days later, having eaten an egg and 2 slices of toast and drunk a cup of tea, he asked for his mail, but found his eyes still hurt too much to permit him to read. "You read for me, Maria," he said. "Never mind the big long letters. Throw them under the table. Read me the small letters." "No can," was the answer. "Teresa, she go to school, she can." So Teresa Silva, aged 9, opened his letters and read them to him. He listened absently to a long dun from the typewriter people, his mind busy with ways and means of finding a job. Suddenly he was shocked back to himself. "We offer you $40 for all serial rights in your story," Teresa slowly spelled out, "provided you allow us to make the alteration suggested." "What magazine is that?" Martin shouted. "Here, give it to me." He could see to read now, and he was aware of the pain of the action. It was the White Mouse that was offering him $40, and the story was The Whirlpool, another of his early horror stories. He read the letter through again and again. The editor told him plainly that he had not handled the idea properly, but that it was the idea that they were buying because it was original. If they could cut the story down 1/3, they would take it and send him $40 on receipt of his answer. He called for pen and ink, and told the editor he could cut the story down 3/3 if he wanted to, and to send the $40 right along. The letter dispatched to the letter-box by Teresa, Martin lay back and thought. It wasn't a lie after all. The White Mouse paid on acceptance. There were 3,000 words in the Whirlpool. Cut down 1/3, there would be 2,000. At $40, that would be 2 cents a word. Pay on acceptance and 2 cents a word. The newspapers had told the truth. And he had thought the White Mouse a third-rater. It was evident that he did not know the magazines. He had deemed the Transcontinental a first-rater, and it paid a cent for 10 words. He had classed the White Mouse as of no account, and it paid 20 times as much as the Transcontinental, and also paid on acceptance. Well, there was one thing certain. When he got well, he would not go out looking for a job. There were more stories in his head as good as the Whirlpool, and at $40 apiece he could earn far more than any job or position. Just when he thought the battle lost, it was won. He had proved for his career. The way was clear. Beginning with the White Mouse, he would add magazine after magazine to his growing list of patrons. Hack work could be put aside. For that matter, it had been wasted time, for it had not brought him $1. He would devote himself to work, good work, and he would pour out the best that was in him. He wished Ruth was there to share in his joy. and when he went over the letters lying on his bed, he found one from her. It was sweetly reproachful, wondering what had kept him away for so dreadful a length of time. He reread the letter adoringly, dwelling over her handwriting, loving each stroke of her pen, and in the end kissing her signature. And when he answered, he told her recklessly that he had not been to see her because his best clothes were in pawn. He told her that he had been sick, but was once more nearly well, and that inside 10 days or 2 weeks, as soon as a letter could travel to New York City and return, he would redeem his clothes and be with her. But Ruth did not care to wait 10 days or 2 weeks. Besides, her lover was sick. The next afternoon, accompanied by Arthur, she arrived in the Morse carriage, to the unqualified delight of the Silva tribe, and of all the urchins on the street, and to the consternation of Maria. She boxed the ears of the Silvas who crowded about the visitors on the tiny front porch, and in more than usual atrocious English tried to apologize for her appearance. Sleeves rolled up from soap-flecked arms, and a wet gunny sack around her waist, told of the task at which she had been caught. So flustered was she by two such grand young people asking for her lodger, that she forgot to invite them to sit down in the little parlor. To enter Martin's room, they passed through the kitchen, warm and moist and steamy from the big washing in progress. Maria, in her excitement, jammed the bedroom and bedroom closet doors together, and for 5 minutes, through the partly open door, clouds of steam, smelling of soap suds and dirt, poured into the sick chamber. Ruth succeeded in veering right and left and right again, and in running the narrow passage between table and bed to Martin's side. But Arthur veered too wide, and fetched up with clatter and bang of pots and pans in the corner, where Martin did his cooking. Arthur did not linger long. Ruth occupied the only chair, and having done his duty, he went outside and stood by the gate, the center of 7 marveling Silvas, who watched him as they would have watched a curiosity in a sideshow. All about the carriage were gathered the children from a dozen blocks, waiting and eager for some tragic and terrible denouement. Carriages were seen on their street only for weddings and funerals. Here was neither marriage nor death, therefore it was something transcending experience and well worth waiting for. Martin had been wild to see Ruth. He was essentially a love nature, and he possessed more than the average man's need for sympathy. He was starving for sympathy, which, with him, meant intelligent understanding. And he had yet to learn that Ruth's sympathy was largely sentimental and tactful, and that it proceeded from gentleness of nature rather than from understanding of the objects of her sympathy. So it was while Martin held her hand and gladly talked, that her love for him prompted her to press his hand in return, and that her eyes were moist and luminous at sight of his helplessness, and of the marks suffering had stamped upon his face. But while he told her of his 2 acceptances, of his despair when he received the one from the Transcontinental, and of the corresponding delight with which he received the one from the White Mouse, she did not follow him. She heard the words he uttered, and understood their literal import, but she was not with him in his despair and his delight. She could not get out of herself. She was not interested in selling stories to magazines. What was important to her was matrimony. She was not aware of it, however, any more than she was aware that her desire that Martin take a position was the instinctive and preparative impulse of motherhood. She would have blushed had she been told as much in plain, set terms, and next she might have grown indignant and asserted that her sole interest lay in the man she loved, and her desire for him to make the best of himself. So, while Martin poured out his heart to her, elated with the first success his chosen work in the world had received, she paid heed to his bare words only, gazing now and again about the room, shocked by what she saw. For the first time, Ruth gazed upon the sordid face of poverty. Starving lovers had always seemed romantic to her, But she had had no idea how starving lovers lived. She had never dreamed it could be like this. Ever her gaze shifted from the room to him and back again. The steamy smell of dirty clothes, which had entered with her from the kitchen, was sickening. Martin must be soaked with it, Ruth concluded, if that awful woman washed frequently. Such was the contagiousness of degradation. When she looked at Martin, she seemed to see the smirch left upon him by his surroundings. She had never seen him unshaven, and the 3 days' growth of beard on his face was repulsive to her. Not alone did it give him the same dark and murky aspect of the Silva house inside and out, but it seemed to emphasize that animal-like strength of his which she detested. And here he was, being confirmed in his madness by the 2 acceptances he took such pride in telling her about. A little longer, and he would have surrendered and gone to work. Now he would continue on in this horrible house, writing and starving for a few more months. "What is that smell?" she asked suddenly. "Some of Maria's washing smells, I imagine," was the answer. "I am growing quite accustomed to them." "No, no, not that. It is something else, a stale, sickish smell." Martin sampled the air before replying. "I can't smell anything else except stale tobacco smoke," he announced. "That's it. It is terrible. Why do you smoke so much, Martin?" "I don't know, except that I smoke more than usual when I am lonely. And then, too, it's such a long-standing habit. I learned when I was only a youngster." "It is not a nice habit, you know," she reproved. "It smells to heaven." "That's the fault of the tobacco. I can afford only the cheapest. But wait until I get that $40 check. I'll use a brand that is not offensive even to the angels. But that wasn't so bad, was it? 2 acceptances in 3 days. That $45 will pay about all my debts." "For 2 years' work?" she queried. "No, for less than a week's work. Please pass me that book over on the far corner of the table, the account book with the gray cover." He opened it and began turning over the pages rapidly. "Yes, I was right. 4 days for the ringing of bells, 2 days for the whirlpool. That's $45 for a week's work, $180 a month. That beats any salary I can command. And besides, I'm just beginning. $1,000 a month is not too much to buy for you all I want you to have. A salary of $500 a month would be too small. That $45 is just a starter. Wait till I get my stride, then watch my smoke." Ruth misunderstood his slang and reverted to cigarettes. "You smoke more than enough as it is, and the brand of tobacco will make no difference. It is the smoking itself that is not nice, no matter what the brand may be. You are a chimney, a living volcano, a perambulating smokestack, and you are a perfect disgrace, Martin dear. You know you are." She leaned toward him, entreaty in her eyes, and as he looked at her delicate face and into her pure, limpid eyes, as of old he was struck with his own unworthiness. "I wish you wouldn't smoke any more," she whispered. "Please, for my sake." "All right, I won't," he cried. "I'll do anything you ask, dear love, anything. You know that." A great temptation assailed her. In an insistent way she had caught glimpses of the large, easy-going side of his nature, and she felt sure, if she asked him to cease attempting to write, that he would grant her wish. In the swift instant that elapsed, the words trembled on her lips, but she did not utter them. She was not quite brave enough. She did not quite dare. Instead, she leaned toward him to meet him, and in his arms murmured, "You know, it is really not for my sake, Martin, but for your own. I am sure smoking hurts you, and besides, it is not good to be a slave to anything, to a drug least of all." "I shall always be your slave," he smiled. "In which case I shall begin issuing my commands." She looked at him mischievously, though deep down she was already regretting that she had not preferred her largest request. "I live but to obey, your Majesty." "Well then, My first commandment is, Thou shalt not omit to shave every day. Look how you have scratched my cheek." And so it ended in caresses and love laughter. But she had made one point, and she could not expect to make more than one at a time. She felt a woman's pride in that she had made him stop smoking. Another time she would persuade him to take a position, for had he not said he would do anything she asked? She left his side to explore the room, examining the clothesline of notes overhead, learning the mystery of the tackle used for suspending his wheel under the ceiling, and being saddened by the heap of manuscripts under the table, which represented to her just so much wasted time. The oil stove won her admiration, but on investigating the food shelves she found them empty. "Why, you haven't anything to eat, you poor dear," she said with tender compassion. "You must be starving." "I store my food in Maria's safe and in her pantry," he lied. "It keeps better there. No danger of my starving. Look at that." She had come back to his side, and she saw him double his arm at the elbow, the biceps crawling under his shirt-sleeve and swelling into a knot of muscle, heavy and hard. The sight repelled her. Sentimentally, she disliked it, but her pulse, her blood, every fiber of her, loved it and yearned for it, and, in the old inexplicable way, she leaned toward him, not away from him. And in the moment that followed, when he crushed her in his arms, the brain of her, concerned with the superficial aspects of life, was in revolt, while the heart of her, the woman of her, concerned with life itself, exulted triumphantly. It was in moments like this that she felt to the uttermost the greatness of her love for Martin, for it was almost a swoon of delight to her to see his strong arms about her, holding her tightly, hurting her with the grip of their fervor. At such moments she found justification for her treason to her standards, for her violation of her own high ideals, and, most of all, for her tacit disobedience to her mother and father. They did not want her to marry this man. It shocked them that she should love him. It shocked her, too, sometimes, when she was apart from him, a cool and reasoning creature. With him, she loved him, in truth, at times of vexed and worried love, but love it was, a love that was stronger than she. "This La Grippe is nothing," he was saying. "It hurts a bit, and gives one a nasty headache, but it doesn't compare with break-bone fever." "Have you had that too?" she queried absently, intent on the heaven-sent justification she was finding in his arms. And so, with absent queries, she led him on, till suddenly his words startled her. He had had the fever in a secret colony of 30 lepers on one of the Hawaiian Islands. "But why did you go there?" she demanded. Such royal carelessness of body seemed criminal. "Because, I don't know," he answered. "I never dreamed of lepers. When I deserted the schooner and landed on the beach, I headed inland for some place of hiding. For 3 days I lived off guavas, ohia apples, and bananas, all of which grew wild in the jungle. On the 4th day I found the trail, a mere foot trail. It led inward, and it led up. It was the way I wanted to go, and it showed signs of recent travel. At one place it ran along the crest of a ridge that was no more than a knife edge. The trail wasn't 3 feet wide on the crest, and on either side the ridge fell away in precipices hundreds of feet deep. One man, with plenty of ammunition, could have held it against 100,000. It was the only way into the hiding place. 3 hours after I found the trail, I was there, in a little mountain valley, a pocket in the midst of lava peaks. The whole place was terraced for taro patches. Fruit trees grew there, and there were 8 or 10 grass huts. But as soon as I saw the inhabitants, I knew what I'd struck. One sight of them was enough. "What did you do?" Ruth demanded breathlessly, listening, like any Desdemona, appalled and fascinated. "Nothing for me to do. Their leader was a kind old fellow, pretty far gone, but he ruled like a king. He had discovered the little valley and founded the settlement. all of which was against the law. But he had guns, plenty of ammunition, and those Kanakas, trained to the shooting of wild cattle and wild pig, were dead shots. No, there wasn't any running away for Martin Eden. He stayed for 3 months. But how did you escape? I'd have been there yet if it hadn't been for a girl there, a half-Chinese, quarter-white, and quarter-Hawaiian. She was a beauty, poor thing, and well-educated. Her mother, in Honolulu, was worth $1 million or so. Well, this girl got me away at last. Her mother financed the settlement, you see, so the girl wasn't afraid of being punished for letting me go. But she made me swear first never to reveal the hiding place, and I never have. This is the first time I've even mentioned it. The girl had just the first signs of leprosy. The fingers on her right hand were slightly twisted, and there was a small spot on her arm. That was all. I guess she is dead now. But weren't you frightened? And weren't you glad to get away without catching that dreadful disease? Well, he confessed, I was a bit shivery at first, but I got used to it. I used to feel sorry for that poor girl, though. That made me forget to be afraid. She was such a beauty, in spirit as well as in appearance, and she was only slightly touched, yet she was doomed to lie there, living the life of a primitive savage and rotting slowly away. Leprosy is far more terrible than you can imagine it. Poor thing, Ruth murmured softly. It's a wonder she let you get away. How do you mean? Martin asked unwittingly. Because she must have loved you, Ruth said, still softly. Candidly now, didn't she? Martin's sunburn had been bleached by his work in the laundry, and by the indoor life he was living, while the hunger and the sickness had made his face even pale, and across this pallor flowed the slow wave of a blush. He was opening his mouth to speak, but Ruth shut him off. Never mind, don't answer. It's not necessary. She laughed. But it seemed to him there was something metallic in her laughter, and that the light in her eyes was cold. On the spur of the moment it reminded him of a gale he had once experienced in the North Pacific. And for the moment the apparition of the gale rose before his eyes, a gale at night, with a clear sky and under a full moon, the huge seas glinting coldly in the moonlight. Next, he saw the girl in the leper refuge, and remembered that it was for love of him that she had let him go. She was noble, he said simply. She gave me life. That was all of the incident, but he heard Ruth muffle a dry sob in her throat, and noticed that she turned her face away to gaze out of the window. When she turned it back to him, it was composed, and there was no hint of the gale in her eyes. I'm such a silly, she said plaintively, but I can't help it. I do love you, Martin. I do, I do. I shall grow more Catholic in time, but at present I can't help getting jealous of those ghosts of the past, and you know your past is full of ghosts. It must be. She silenced his protest. It could not be otherwise. And there's poor Arthur motioning me to come. He's tired waiting. And now, good-bye, dear. There's some kind of a mixture put up by the druggists that helps men to stop the use of tobacco. She called back from the door, and I'm going to send you some. The door closed, but opened again. I do, she whispered to him, and this time she was really gone. Maria, with worshipful eyes that none the less were keen to note the texture of Ruth's garments and the cut of them, a cut unknown that produced an effect mysteriously beautiful, saw her to the carriage. The crowd of disappointed urchins stared till the carriage disappeared from view, then transferred their stare to Maria, who had abruptly become the most important person on the street. But it was one of her progeny who blasted Maria's reputation by announcing that the grand visitors had been for her lodger. After that, Maria dropped back into her old obscurity, and Martin began to notice the respectful manner in which he was regarded by the small fry of the neighborhood. As for Maria, Martin rose in her estimation a full 100%. and had the Portuguese grocer witnessed that afternoon carriage call, he would have allowed Martin an additional $3.85 worth of credit. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. The sun of Martin's good fortune rose. The day after Ruth's visit, he received a check for $3 from a New York scandal weekly in payment for 3 of his triolets. 2 days later, a newspaper published in Chicago accepted his treasure hunters, promising to pay $10 for it on publication. The price was small, but it was the first article he had written, his very first attempt to express his thought on the printed page. To cap everything, the adventure serial for boys, his second attempt, was accepted before the end of the week by a juvenile monthly calling itself Youth and Age. It was true the serial was 21,000 words, and they offered to pay him $16 on publication, which was something like 75 cents a thousand words, but it was equally true that it was the second thing he had attempted to write, and that he was himself thoroughly aware of its clumsy worthlessness. But even his earliest efforts were not marked with the clumsiness of mediocrity. What characterized them was the clumsiness of too great strength, the clumsiness which the tyro betrays when he crushes butterflies with battering rams and hammers out vignettes with a war club. So it was that Martin was glad to sell his early efforts for songs. He knew them for what they were, and it had not taken him long to acquire this knowledge. What he pinned his faith to was his later work. He had striven to be something more than a mere writer of magazine fiction. He had sought to equip himself with the tools of artistry. On the other hand, he had not sacrificed strength. His conscious aim had been to increase his strength by avoiding excess of strength. Nor had he departed from his love of reality. His work was realism, though he had endeavored to fuse with it the fancies and beauties of imagination. What he sought was an impassioned realism, shot through with human aspiration and faith. What he wanted was life as it was, with all its spirit groping and soul-reaching left in. He had discovered, in the course of his reading, 2 schools of fiction. One treated of man as a god, ignoring his earthly origin. The other treated of man as a clod, ignoring his heaven-sent dreams and divine possibilities. Both the god and the clod schools erred, in Martin's estimation, and erred through too great singleness of sight and purpose. There was a compromise that approximated the truth, though it flattered not the school of God, while it challenged the brute savageness of the school of clod. It was his story, Adventure, which had dragged him with Ruth, that Martin believed had achieved his ideal of the true in fiction, and it was in an essay, God and Clod, that he had expressed his views on the whole general subject. But Adventure, and all that he deemed his best work, still went begging among the editors. His early work counted for nothing in his eyes except for the money it brought, and his horror stories, 2 of which had sold, he did not consider high work nor his best work. To him they were frankly imaginative and fantastic, though invested with all the glamour of the real, wherein lay their power. This investiture of the grotesque and impossible with reality he looked upon as a trick, a skilful trick at best. Great literature could not reside in such a field. Their artistry was high, but he denied the worthwhileness of artistry when divorced from humanness. The trick had been to fling over the face of his artistry a mask of humanness. And this he had done in the half-dozen or so stories of the horror brand he had written before he emerged upon the high peaks of adventure, joy, the pot, and the wine of life. The $3 he received for the triolets he used to eke out a precarious existence against the arrival of the white mouse check. He cashed the first check with the suspicious Portuguese grocer, paying $1 on account and dividing the remaining $2 between the baker and the fruit store. Martin was not rich enough to afford meat, and he was on slim allowance when the White Mouse check arrived. He was divided on the cashing of it. He had never been in a bank in his life, much less been in one on business. And he had a naive and childlike desire to walk into one of the big banks down in Oakland and fling down his endorsed check for $40. On the other hand, practical common sense ruled that he should cash it with his grocer, and thereby make an impression that would later result in an increase of credit. Reluctantly, Martin yielded to the claims of the grocer, paying his bill with him in full, and receiving in change a pocketful of jingling coin. Also, he paid the other tradesmen in full, redeemed his suit and his bicycle, paid 1 month's rent on the typewriter, and paid Maria the overdue month for his room, and a month in advance. This left him in his pocket, for emergencies, a balance of nearly $3. In itself, this small sum seemed a fortune. Immediately on recovering his clothes, he had gone to see Ruth, and on the way he could not refrain from jingling the little handful of silver in his pocket. He had been so long without money that, like a rescued starving man who could not let unconsumed food out of his sight, Martin had not kept his hand off the silver. He was not mean nor avaricious, but the money meant more than so many dollars and cents. It stood for success, and the eagles stamped upon the coins were to him so many winged victories. It came to him insensibly that it was a very good world. It certainly appeared more beautiful to him. For weeks it had been a very dull and somber world, but now, with nearly all debts paid, $3 jingling in his pocket, and in his mind the consciousness of success, the sun shone bright and warm, and even a rain squall that soaked unprepared pedestrians seemed a merry happening to him. When he starved, his thoughts had dwelled upon the thousands he knew were starving the world over. But now that he was feasted full, the fact of the thousands starving was no longer pregnant in his brain. He forgot about them, and, being in love, remembered the countless lovers of the world. Without deliberately thinking about it, motifs for love lyrics began to agitate his brain. Swept away by the creative impulse, he got off the electric car, without vexation, 2 blocks beyond his crossing. He found a number of persons in the Morse home. Ruth's 2 girl cousins were visiting her from San Rafael, and Mrs. Morse, under pretext of entertaining them, was pursuing her plan of surrounding Ruth with young people. The campaign had begun during Martin's enforced absence, and was already in full swing. She was making a point of having at the house men who were doing things. Thus, in addition to the cousins Dorothy and Florence, Martin encountered 2 university professors, one of Latin, the other of English, a young army officer just back from the Philippines, one-time schoolmate of Ruth's, a young fellow named Melville, private secretary to Joseph Perkins, head of the San Francisco Trust Company, and finally of the men, a live bank cashier, Charles Hapgood, a youngish man of 35, graduate of Stanford University, member of the Nile Club and the Unity Club, and a conservative speaker for the Republican Party during campaigns. In short, a rising young man in every way. Among the women was one who painted portraits, another who was a professional musician, and still another who possessed the degree of Doctor of Sociology, and who was locally famous for her social settlement work in the slums of San Francisco. But the women did not count much in Mrs. Morse's plan. At the best, they were necessary accessories. The men who did things must be drawn to the house somehow. "Don't get excited when you talk," Ruth admonished Martin, before the ordeal of introduction began. He bore himself a bit stiffly at first, oppressed by a sense of his own awkwardness, especially of his shoulders, which were up to their old trick of threatening destruction to furniture and ornaments. Also, he was rendered self-conscious by the company. He had never before been in contact with such exalted beings, nor with so many of them. Melville, the bank cashier, fascinated him, and he resolved to investigate him at the first opportunity. For underneath Martin's awe lurked his assertive ego, and he felt the urge to measure himself with these men and women, and to find out what they had learned from the books and life which he had not learned. Ruth's eyes roved to him frequently to see how he was getting on, and she was surprised and gladdened by the ease with which he got acquainted with her cousins. He certainly did not grow excited, while being seated removed from him the worry of his shoulders. Ruth knew them for clever girls, superficially brilliant, and she could scarcely understand their praise of Martin later that night at going to bed. But he, on the other hand, a wit of his own class, a gay quizzer and laughter-maker at dances and Sunday picnics, had found the making of fun and the breaking of good-natured lances simple enough in this environment. And on this evening success stood at his back, patting him on the shoulder, and telling him he was making good, so that he could afford to laugh and make laughter and remain unabashed. Later, Ruth's anxiety found justification. Martin and Professor Caldwell had got together in a conspicuous corner, and though Martin no longer wove the air with his hands, to Ruth's critical eye he permitted his own eyes to flash and glitter too frequently, talked too rapidly and warmly, grew too intense, and allowed his aroused blood to redden his cheeks too much. He lacked decorum and control, and was in decided contrast to the young professor of English with whom he talked. But Martin was not concerned with appearances. He had been swift to note the other's trained mind, and to appreciate his command of knowledge. Furthermore, Professor Caldwell did not realize Martin's concept of the average English professor. Martin wanted him to talk shop, and, though he seemed averse at first, succeeded in making him do it. For Martin did not see why a man should not talk shop. "It's absurd and unfair," he had told Ruth weeks before, "this objection to talking shop. For what reason under the sun do men and women come together, if not for the exchange of the best that is in them? And the best that is in them is what they are interested in, the thing by which they make their living, the thing they've specialized on and sat up days and nights over, and even dreamed about. Imagine Mr. Butler living up to social etiquette and enunciating his views on Paul Verlaine, or the German drama, or the novels of D'Annunzio. We'd be bored to death. I, for one, if I must listen to Mr. Butler, prefer to hear him talk about his law. It's the best that is in him, and life is so short that I want the best of every man and woman I meet. But," Ruth had objected, "there are the topics of general interest to all." "There you mistake," he had rushed on. "All persons in society, all cliques in society, or rather, nearly all persons and cliques, ape their betters. Now, who are the best betters? The idlers, the wealthy idlers. They do not know, as a rule, the things known by the persons who are doing something in the world. To listen to conversation about such things would mean to be bored, wherefore the idlers decree that such things are shop and must not be talked about. Likewise, they decree the things that are not shop and which may be talked about, and those things are the latest operas, latest novels, cards, billiards, cocktails, automobiles, horse shows, trout fishing, tuna fishing, big game shooting, yacht sailing, and so forth. And, mark you, these are the things the idlers know. In all truth, they constitute the shop talk of the idlers. And the funniest part of it is that many of the clever people, and all the would-be clever people, allow the idlers so to impose upon them. As for me, I want the best a man's got in him. Call it shop vulgarity or anything you please." And Ruth had not understood. This attack of his on the established had seemed to her just so much willfulness of opinion. So Martin contaminated Professor Caldwell with his own earnestness, challenging him to speak his mind. As Ruth paused beside them, she heard Martin saying, "You surely don't pronounce such heresies in the University of California." Professor Caldwell shrugged his shoulders. "The honest taxpayer and the politician, you know. Sacramento gives us our appropriations, and therefore we kowtow to Sacramento, and to the Board of Regents, and to the party press, or to the press of both parties. Yes, that's clear, but how about you? Martin urged. You must be a fish out of the water. Few like me, I imagine, in the university pond. Sometimes I am fairly sure that I am out of water, and that I should belong in Paris, in Grub Street, in a hermit's cave, or in some sadly wild bohemian crowd, drinking claret, Dago red, they call it in San Francisco, dining in cheap restaurants in the Latin Quarter, and expressing vociferously radical views upon all creation. Really, I am frequently almost sure that I was cut out to be a radical. But then, there are so many questions on which I am not sure. I grow timid when I am face to face with my human frailty, which ever prevents me from grasping all the factors in any problem, human, vital problems, you know. And as he talked on, Martin became aware that to his own lips had come the song of the trade wind. I am strongest at noon, but under the moon I stiffen the bunt of the sail. He was almost humming the words, and it dawned upon him that the other reminded him of the trade wind, of the northeast trade, steady and cool and strong. He was equable. He was to be relied upon, and withal there was a certain bafflement about him. Martin had the feeling that he never spoke his full mind, just as he had often had the feeling that the trades never blew their strongest, but always held reserves of strength that were never used. Martin's trick of visioning was active as ever. His brain was a most accessible storehouse of remembered fact and fancy, and its contents seemed ever ordered and spread for his inspection. Whatever occurred in the instant present, Martin's mind immediately presented associated antithesis or similitude, which ordinarily expressed themselves to him in vision. It was sheerly automatic, and his visioning was an unfailing accompaniment to the living present, just as Ruth's face, in a momentary jealousy, had called before his eyes a forgotten moonlight gale, and as Professor Caldwell made him see again the northeast trade, herding the white billows across the purple sea, so, from moment to moment, not disconcerting, but rather identifying and classifying, new memory visions rose before him, or spread under his eyelids, or were thrown upon the screen of his consciousness. These visions came out of the actions and sensations of the past, out of things and events and books of yesterday and last week. A countless host of apparitions that, waking or sleeping, forever thronged his mind. So it was, as he listened to Professor Caldwell's easy flow of speech, the conversation of a clever, cultured man, that Martin kept seeing himself down all his past. He saw himself when he had been quite the hoodlum, wearing a stiff-rimmed Stetson hat and a square-cut double-breasted coat, with a certain swagger to the shoulders, and possessing the ideal of being as tough as the police permitted. He did not disguise it to himself, nor attempt to palliate it. At one time in his life he had been just a common hoodlum, the leader of a gang that worried the police and terrorized honest, working-class householders. But his ideals had changed. He glanced about him at the well-bred, well-dressed men and women, and breathed into his lungs the atmosphere of culture and refinement, and at the same moment the ghost of his early youth, in stiff rim and square cut, with swagger and toughness, stalked across the room. This figure of the corner hoodlum he saw merge into himself, sitting and talking with an actual university professor. For, after all, he had never found his permanent abiding place. He had fitted in wherever he found himself, been a favorite always and everywhere, by virtue of holding his own at work and at play, and by his willingness and ability to fight for his rights and command respect. But he had never taken root. He had fitted in sufficiently to satisfy his fellows, but not to satisfy himself. He had been perturbed always by a feeling of unrest, had heard always the call of something from beyond, and had wandered on through life, seeking it, until he found books and art and love. And here he was, in the midst of all this, the only one of all the comrades he had adventured with who could have made themselves eligible for the inside of the Morse home. But such thoughts and visions did not prevent him from following Professor Caldwell closely, and as he followed, comprehendingly and critically, he noted the unbroken field of the other's knowledge. As for himself, from moment to moment the conversation showed him gaps and open stretches, whole subjects with which he was unfamiliar. Nevertheless, thanks to his Spencer, he saw that he possessed the outlines of the field of knowledge. It was a matter only of time when he would fill in the outline. Then, watch out, he thought. Wear shoal, everybody. He felt like sitting at the feet of the professor, worshipful and absorbent. But, as he listened, he began to discern a weakness in the other's judgments, a weakness so stray and elusive that he might not have caught it had it not been ever present. And when he did catch it, he leapt to equality at once. Ruth came up to them a second time, just as Martin began to speak. "I'll tell you where you are wrong, or, rather, what weakens your judgments," he said. "You lack biology. There is no place in your scheme of things, I mean the real interpretive biology, from the ground up, from the laboratory and the test tube and the vitalized inorganic, right up to the widest aesthetic and sociological generalizations." Ruth was appalled. She had sat 2 lecture courses under Professor Caldwell, and looked up to him as the living repository of all knowledge. "I scarcely follow you," he said dubiously. Martin was not so sure but what he had followed him. "Then I'll try to explain," he said. "I remember reading in Egyptian history something to the effect that understanding could not be had of Egyptian art without first studying the land question." "Quite right," the professor nodded. "And it seems to me," Martin continued, "that knowledge of the land question, in turn, of all questions, for that matter, cannot be had without previous knowledge of the stuff and the constitution of life. How can we understand laws and institutions, religions and customs, without understanding, not merely the nature of the creatures that made them, but the nature of the stuff out of which the creatures are made? Is literature any less human than the architecture and sculpture of Egypt? Is there one thing in the known universe that is not subject to the law of evolution? Oh, I know there is an elaborate evolution of the various arts laid down, but it seems to me to be too mechanical. The human himself is left out. The evolution of the tool, of the harp, of music and song and dance are all beautifully elaborated. But how about the evolution of the human himself? The development of the basic and intrinsic parts that were in him before he made his first tool or gibbered his first chant? It is that which you do not consider, and which I call biology. It is biology in its largest aspects. I know I express myself incoherently, but I've tried to hammer out the idea. It came to me as you were talking, so I was not primed and ready to deliver it. You spoke yourself of the human frailty that prevented one from taking all the factors into consideration, and you, in turn, or so it seems to me, leave out the biological factor, the very stuff out of which has been spun the fabric of all our arts, the warp and the woof of all human actions and achievements. To Ruth's amazement, Martin was not immediately crushed, and that the professor replied in the way he did struck her as forbearance for Martin's youth. Professor Caldwell sat for a full minute, silent and fingering his watch-chain. "Do you know," he said at last, "I've had that same criticism passed on me once before, by a very great man, a scientist and evolutionist, Joseph LeConte. But he is dead, and I thought to remain undetected. And now you come along and expose me. Seriously, though, and this is confession, I think there is something in your contention, a great deal, in fact. I am too classical, not enough up to date in the interpretive branches of science, and I can only plead the disadvantages of my education and a temperamental slothfulness that prevents me from doing the work. I wonder if you'll believe that I've never been inside a physics or chemistry laboratory. It is true, nevertheless. LeConte was right, and so are you, Mr. Eden, at least to an extent. How much, I do not know. Ruth drew Martin away with her on a pretext. When she had got him aside, whispering, "You shouldn't have monopolized Professor Caldwell that way. There may be others who want to talk with him." "My mistake," Martin admitted contritely. "But I'd got him stirred up, and he was so interesting that I did not think. Do you know, he is the brightest, the most intellectual man I have ever talked with. And I'll tell you something else. I once thought that everybody who went to universities, or who sat in the high places in society, was just as brilliant and intelligent as he." "He's an exception," she answered. "I should say so. Whom do you want me to talk to now? Oh, say, bring me up against that cashier fellow." Martin talked for 15 minutes with him, nor could Ruth have wished better behavior on her lover's part. Not once did his eyes flash, nor his cheeks flush, while the calmness and poise with which he talked surprised her. But in Martin's estimation the whole tribe of bank cashiers fell a few 100%, and for the rest of the evening he labored under the impression that bank cashiers and talkers of platitudes were synonymous phrases. The army officer he found good-natured and simple, a healthy, wholesome young fellow, content to occupy the place in life into which birth and luck had flung him. On learning that he had completed 2 years in the university, Martin was puzzled to know where he had stored it away. Nevertheless, Martin liked him better than the platitudinous bank cashier. "I really don't object to platitudes," he told Ruth later, "but what worries me into nervousness is the pompous, smugly complacent, superior certitude with which they are uttered, and the time taken to do it. Why, I could give that man the whole history of the Reformation in the time he took to tell me that the Union Labor Party had fused with the Democrats. Do you know, he skins his words as a professional poker player skins the cards that are dealt out to him. Some day I'll show you what I mean." "I'm sorry you don't like him," was her reply. "He's a favorite of Mr. Butler's. Mr. Butler says he is safe and honest, calls him the Rock, Peter, and says that upon him any banking institution can well be built. I don't doubt it, from the little I saw of him and the less I heard from him, but I don't think so much of banks as I did. You don't mind my speaking my mind this way, dear?" "No, no, it is most interesting." "Yes," Martin went on heartily, "I'm no more than a barbarian getting my first impressions of civilization. Such impressions must be entertainingly novel to the civilized person." "What did you think of my cousins?" Ruth queried. "I liked them better than the other women. There's plenty of fun in them along with paucity of pretense." "Then you did like the other women?" He shook his head. "That social settlement woman is no more than a sociological poll parrot. I swear, if you winnowed her out between the stars, like Tomlinson, there would be found in her not one original thought. As for the portrait painter, she was a positive bore. She'd make a good wife for the cashier. And the musician woman, I don't care how nimble her fingers are, how perfect her technique, how wonderful her expression. The fact is, she knows nothing about music." "She plays beautifully," Ruth protested. "Yes, she's undoubtedly gymnastic in the externals of music, but the intrinsic spirit of music is unguessed by her. I asked her what music meant to her. You know I'm always curious to know that particular thing. And she did not know what it meant to her, except that she adored it, and that it was the greatest of the arts, and that it meant more than life to her." "You were making them talk shop," Ruth charged him. "I confess it. And if they were failures on shop, imagine my sufferings if they had discoursed on other subjects. Why, I used to think that up here, where all the advantages of culture were enjoyed—" He paused for a moment, and watched the youthful shade of himself, in stiff rim and square cut, enter the door and swagger across the room. "As I was saying, up here I thought all men and women were brilliant and radiant, but now, from what little I've seen of them, they strike me as a pack of ninnies, most of them, and 90% of the remainder as bores. Now, there's Professor Caldwell. He's different. He's a man, every inch of him, and every atom of his gray matter." Ruth's face brightened. "Tell me about him," she urged. "Not what is large and brilliant. I know those qualities. But whatever you feel is adverse, I am most curious to know." "Perhaps I'll get myself in a pickle." Martin debated humorously for a moment. "Suppose you tell me first. Or maybe you find in him nothing less than the best." "I attended 2 lecture courses under him, and I have known him for 2 years. That is why I am anxious for your first impression." "Bad impression, you mean. Well, here goes. He is all the fine things you think about him, I guess. At least he is the finest specimen of intellectual man I have met. But he is a man with a secret shame." "Oh, no, no," he hastened to cry. "Nothing paltry nor vulgar. What I mean is that he strikes me as a man who has gone to the bottom of things, and is so afraid of what he saw that he makes believe to himself that he never saw it. Maybe that's not the clearest way to express it. Here's another way. A man who has found the path to the hidden temple but has not followed it, who has, perhaps, caught glimpses of the temple and striven afterward to convince himself that it was only a mirage of foliage. Yet another way. A man who could have done things, but who placed no value on the doing, and who, all the time, in his innermost heart, is regretting that he has not done them, who has secretly laughed at the rewards for doing, and yet, still more secretly, has yearned for the rewards and for the joy of doing." "I don't read him that way," she said. "And for that matter, I don't see just what you mean." "It is only a vague feeling on my part," Martin temporized. "I have no reason for it. It is only a feeling, and most likely it is wrong. You certainly should know him better than I." From the evening at Ruth's, Martin brought away with him strange confusions and conflicting feelings. He was disappointed in his goal, in the persons he had climbed to be with. On the other hand, he was encouraged with his success. The climb had been easier than he expected. He was superior to the climb, and he did not, with false modesty, hide it from himself. He was superior to the beings among whom he had climbed, with the exception, of course, of Professor Caldwell. About life and the books he knew more than they, and he wondered into what nooks and crannies they had cast aside their educations. He did not know that he was himself possessed of unusual brain vigor, nor did he know that the persons who were given to probing the depths and to thinking ultimate thoughts were not to be found in the drawing-rooms of the world's Morses. Nor did he dream that such persons were as lonely eagles, sailing solitary in the azure sky, far above the earth and its swarming freight of gregarious life. End of chapter 27.